we've got a quorum. Mark, go ahead.
Thanks, Eric. I'd like to call the select board to order.
And Chuck?
I'll call the school committee to order. I think we have a quorum here. I see Carla and Aaron
We're all here, Chuck.
and Tom. Yep. And Sean.
John.
Sorry, I'm still scanning. We have everybody, right? I see Paula, Ed. Is Dan on? There's Dan. I saw Sean, Gene, and Nick. All right, thank you, everybody. Okay, we're back. So I think what we're going to do tonight is, we heard we heard a good and thorough presentation last week on projected revenues impacted by COVID-19 for fiscal year 21, and some anticipated costs associated with it, and then the proposed actions to take to accommodate that. It was a mixture of budget cuts and free cash and reduction of capital plan and so on. I think a good framing was definitely the kind of temporary versus potentially more permanent cuts in revenue, and then therefore in considering how to handle that, looking at different levers accordingly. Again, some that might be more one time versus those that might be more baked in and ongoing. So objective for tonight then is to kind of hopefully we've all had a chance to take that on board and think it through, and to have continue the discussion from the other night. And then of course we will be Finance Committee will be voting tonight on the revised warrant articles. So with that, let's see. Anybody from the I know the school committee met last week, and I did have a chance to see some of that. My understanding is you did not meet then tonight prior to this meeting. But any input or comment from anybody on the school committee or the select board at this point?
So Eric, this is Chuck. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. I had used the raise hand function. So as you know, we met Thursday night, and we had quite a long dialogue on it, and unfortunately with the technology ran out of time to make a decision, but I can give some color on kind of where it ended, and let me back up and first say a couple things. One, I have and I said this at the school committee, I know the school committee has the utmost respect for the town and school staff that put all the work into coming to us with these recommendations. So we truly are thankful and appreciate that. Second to that is I was given the heads up that when we were having our school discussion, maybe, and I'll take the hit for it, maybe if we came across as or I came across as fighting for the school cuts. That's certainly never the case. In fact, at your meeting last week, when I was referring to using some portion or all free cash to solve this predicament we're in, I was referring to the whole town, not just the schools. So whatever we advocate, or I advocate for, is always for everybody, not just for the schools. So I just want to make that clear. And one of the things that I thought was a good conversation at our meeting the other night was started by Sean Brandt, and he posed the question to Dr. Doherty and Gail Dowd as to, you know, if you had and I'm maybe not saying exactly what he said, if you had to prioritize what you could put back if you couldn't put anything back, the top of both of their list was the HR payroll administrator. So, you know, and as we've all had time to think about it and had time to talk to the superintendent, and again, I'm speaking for myself and some, but I haven't spoken to everybody. I think that maybe trying to put everything back isn't a good idea, because they, again, as I said, I have the utmost respect in what they did, and they feel comfortable that, you know, all of the cuts aren't going to make us take a step backwards. In making those with the backdrop of still not really knowing what the potential future expenses could be with the COVID-19 crisis. So, yeah, I guess after having that conversation with them, or subsequent to our meeting, and thinking it through more myself, you know, I guess I would back off and I'd obviously like other school committee members to weigh in, because we haven't had a meeting to discuss this, but my opinion is that, you know, we back off or I back off the feeling that we want to use a full free cash to restore everything, and just concentrate on, you know, what I heard loud and clear the other night was, you know, the HR payroll administrator. And one thing that didn't come up, but has been bothering me a little bit, and I've mentioned it a little bit to Dr. Doherty, bothered me a little bit, and this goes for the town and the schools, is the 1% COLA cut. I can't get in my mind where that's fair to them, and that was for the non-represented employees. Now, we're not doing anything, and nor have we had any discussion or want to have any discussion about doing anything with represented employees. But so that's not even on the table. But at this point, I don't think you know, the non-represented employees should have to take that hit right now. So I would like to see the finance committee find a level of free cash to restore that HR payroll position, and then any other position that the town feels that they'd like to leave, and then have the take away that 1% COLA cut for the non-represented employees. Again, I just don't feel like that's the right fair thing to do right now to that much smaller group of employees. And I will apologize, I didn't do the math in terms of how much we're talking about when you add those two things together. But, so I guess I'll stop rambling. That's all I have to say at the moment. Thank you.
No, thanks, Chuck, for those comments and clarifications of at least your position. Certainly interested in hearing from other members of the school committee as requested. Before we get there, could I ask a clarification question of Bob and John? The 1% COLA cut, precisely what that is a 1 percentage point reduction from the increase that would have otherwise been put into effect. So is that true? Meaning if the COLA increase was slated to have been 2%, it will instead be 1%. Or if it was slated to be 3%, it will instead be 2%. Is that the right way to think about that, number one? And then, I don't know if you have it at your fingertips, anybody from administration, to Chuck's question, what are the dollar amounts that we would be talking about there?
For the schools, I believe it's about $53,000.
And am I thinking about that the right way, the 1%?
Yes.
Thank
Yes.
you. Okay. Thanks, John.
For the town, what we discussed was certainly foregoing 1% at the start of the year and hoping to do it mid-year. The school budget being bottom line has a lot more flexibility to do that. Our lines don't. So what we've shown in the budget in front of you is a $35,000 cut, which assumes a 6-month reduction of the 1%, with the possibility that next January the select board could increase that. If they don't, we would have a surplus of another $35,000. So it would be $70,000. We have a few more non-union than John does, but we've only actually cut $35,000.
Thanks, Bob. And then, John, on the HR payroll administrator, forgive me if it was in the packet. I just don't recall
No, it's okay.
the number there.
60,000.
Thank you. So we'll open it up to, and I see, why don't we, I feel like I see some raised hands. I think we'll continue that procedure tonight. I was a little hesitant last time, not wanting to, if we were all in a room, we would all talk, right? And I don't want to come across as too rigid here, but at the same time, there are a lot of us in a weird medium. So if it's okay with everybody, I'd like to proceed with that again tonight. And so I did see Vanessa, and then Sean, I see yours too. So Vanessa, please go ahead.
Thanks, Eric. It's Vanessa Alvaro from the Select Board. I echo Chuck's comments on the COLA increases for the non-represented employees. I would be curious to know what level these employees are as well. But if that's something that FinCom could allow, these are challenging times right now, and it doesn't feel right to have a small percentage of the staff be sort of disproportionately affected by what is happening more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Sean, Brand, please go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to expand on it, but I just want to kind of endorse Chuck's position. I think that HR and payroll position is pretty important strategically to some of the goals that the schools have, and I agree with both Chuck and Vanessa on the COLA piece.
And sorry, John, you said 65 on the HR payroll position.
60.
60, sorry. Mm-hmm. So it's about 150,000, 148. Mark, I see your hand raised, please.
Thanks, Eric. Excuse me. Thanks, folks. I apologize. I didn't make the last meeting, although I did read through all the information. What I have a slightly different focus on this. Not sure in terms of kind of the pieces that are being discussed, but it struck me that at a macro level, one of the biggest issues is how much free cash do we think we want to allow to be used in this piece here for the parts that we think are, I'll call it non-recurring. And what struck me in looking at the numbers is traditionally we've used between 1 to 1.2 million, or we've allowed that we would use between 1 and 1.2 million. And what we found in the past is a lot of the money actually came back into the system, and that's why our free cash balance has been increasing. I know that the original discussion, I think, for this year was to allow, 1.25, so kind of in that same ballpark. And now the discussion is to say, let's take another $500,000 to bring it to $1.75 million. I think that's a pretty responsible number. I kind of had in my own head that up to 2 million might be a reasonable amount to be using. I don't know that we're going to regenerate nearly as much free cash as we have in the past. And some of those estimates have already been taken down. But in my head, I kind of had this notion of up to $2 million with the notion that some of it would in fact regenerate. So we wouldn't actually use all of it, but to be prepared that we might need it. The other question related to that is, and I don't know if you guys discussed this, and I apologize if you did. If it turns out that we're going to have to do daily or extremely regular cleaning of all the buildings, does the budget that's in place for materials, wages, and all those activities, does that already contemplate that? It struck me that looking at those numbers, probably not. They didn't seem high enough to me. And kind of where I'm going with this is it may be that we need a little bit more of a buffer, and maybe the 1.75 use of free cash is right, knowing that it may jump to 2, kind of just having a little buffer fund for things like cleaning. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Mark. Fair question, certainly on the free cash, and I imagine once we have a deeper discussion on the Finance Committee, we'll tackle that. Bob or John, and I'm not sure if Joe's on, remind us on the cleaning piece. My memory is that some of that was built in.
Yeah, Joe Huggins is on, and he can
Oh, great.
shed some light. This revised budget sort of placeholds 75,000 into Joe's budget for related expenses, whatever they may be. They could be supplies, PPE, it could be cleaning. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we were planning on doing, we are going to see an increase in the chemicals that we're going to be using, the disinfectants and the sanitizers that we're going to be using in the school and the town buildings. And the frequency of the cleaning with the staff we have will be diverted to doing different things on a nightly basis. And what I mean by that is we're going to probably divert from doing floor burnishing and buffing and things like that to doing high touch areas on a nightly basis, just doing doorknobs, fixtures, and just more of that type of thing. And that will be with in-house staff as well as the outside contractors in the town and school buildings. But we have already installed more hand sanitizer stations throughout all the town and school buildings. We are going to be going through quite a bit more of that. We're stocking up right now in preparation for the rollout when people do start coming back, and getting stuff in for next year. So I think that number is a fair estimate.
Sorry. Thanks, Joe. Mark, did you have any follow-up there to that?
No, thanks. I think that was my core question. We just don't know how much cleaning is required, but Joe, that makes sense, and you've already looked at it, so that's what I was hoping for.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Nick, who's still on his MacBook. Nick. Nick, you're on mute.
Sorry about that.
Sorry.
All right. So, question about staffing for the HR position and both the existing staffing, if this position isn't filled in the schools. So, in the school and the town, how many people do we have responsible for making sure that the payroll function is performed? And what's the redundancy or the backup plan if one of those people becomes sick or for whatever reason isn't able to perform that work?
I can answer for the school side if you want.
Yes, please.
Eric or Bob. So on the school side, we have half a payroll person. So handling the payroll on the school side. So I have half an FTE along with myself. And then that the payroll person is half payroll, half HR. So there's the HR administrator and half of the payroll person, myself, and half of the payroll person. So there is no redundancy. We did have the individual go out today. We had to hire an external temp because we did not have any internal resources to cover the position. And for segregation of duty purposes, there are certain things that the payroll person has to do that I actually cannot do. So there is no redundancy. So oftentimes we do work very closely and rely very heavily on the town to assist us. But I know that they, which I'm sure Bob can speak to, have challenges on their side with their staffing levels as well.
Is it okay if I comment on the?
Please, Sharon, of course.
So on the town side, we have a treasurer and assistant treasurer. They both are fully trained to do payroll and could assist any admin that needed assistance. Obviously, that would be a tall order for the school department. They're the biggest payroll that we have with all the different schools, but we could get through it. But the redundancy in that position, I think, is very necessary. You're vulnerable to somebody being out, or it just definitely is something that I would think is a crucial position to have redundancy, to have a second person who knows how to do all the payroll. On our side, we do have 2 people who fully know how to do payroll and several people who know a lot of pieces of the payroll. So we do have some redundancy built in on the town side. I'd like to see that on the school side. Thank you.
Nick, any follow-up there?
Yeah, just in reflect back a quick observation. So it sounds, just what I'm hearing is that the school side is complex and has ethical barriers that prevent, one person from doing everything. Is that fair, Gail? So it's important to have 2 different human beings involved in the payroll process.
Right, from a segregation of duties, you have to have a preparer and a reviewer. So whoever's entering it cannot be the same person to review it from a control standpoint.
So from my impression, this seems pretty important to me in terms of the integrity of the organization and the schools being able to function. This seems like an important part of a very, very complex organization, but that's my initial impression. Thanks, Eric.
No, thanks, Nick. Paula, please go ahead.
What I struggled with, and I think what we're all struggling with, is how much of this is permanent. Because if it was just all one time, I could get really aggressive with free cash because we're in such a healthy position. But it's the question of what's permanent, what's responsible to do for the future in terms of some of these cuts. And independently, I had the same reaction to the COLA decrease for non-union employees and also the importance of the HR administrator. So those are 2 priorities that I'd like to see us make some exception for. And I don't like going down that road of treating non-union employees different in that respect. And I think it's, especially in this time, why are we going to put more people in that position? And it's so challenging because I feel like we're designing and building shelter in the middle of a hurricane. So I really hope we can look to use November town meeting to really then look and make some major adjustments as needed, hopefully in a positive direction. But of course, we don't know that. So I am comfortable using more free cash as needed for those kind of things. But I get that we are going to expect to see some permanent impact to this. And that I almost feel like it would be irresponsible to think otherwise. So I guess the biggest thing is to use November to put more effort into November to adjust both the, maybe capital and operating budget. Hopefully it'll allow us, and we'll have more information at that point. And that's all.
Thank you, Paula. Aaron, please.
Hi, Erin Gaffin, School Committee. I just wanted to chime in as another voice of the school committee. We had the beginning of a really interesting conversation on Thursday night about the budget and the cuts and what approach we were going to recommend tonight before we got cut off. But it also gave me a lot to think about before tonight. I agree with what Chuck is proposing. Sitting through the budget meetings this past winter and through multiple meetings, it's been more than justified to me that the need in central office for this HR payroll position And I feel like we don't want to leave them shorthanded now more than ever. And I would certainly get behind not cutting from the COLA increases for our unrepresented staff. So just wanted to say that I was in agreement with those.
Thank you, Erin. Real quick on the school committee the other night, you guys ran into a time pressure at the end. What drove that, and does that apply to us as well? Does anybody know?
I think it's a team's limitation.
It was a team's limitation.
A team?
It's since been extended to be 16 hours, but at the time it was thought we only had 4 hours.
Cool. So we can look forward to 16-hour meetings.
Yeah.
Microsoft Teams, is that what you're talking about?
Yes, sir.
Oh. Okay.
Eric, you make me nervous. How long do you expect to go?
Well,
Some of us have a baseball game from the 70s that we want to watch tonight.
no one ruined it for Chuck. Ed, please go ahead.
Thanks, Eric. Ed Ross, Finance Committee. So again, Bob and John and Sharon, Gail, thanks again. I can echoing from last week, all of the effort, kind of putting in here, identifying different things. And I'll just, kind of start with what I mentioned in the meeting last week. I really appreciate, that exploration of all options, kind of given where we are now, where we think we might be in 6 months and longer. And so, again, as it was outlined, kind of originally, I supported that. And I think the main thing that I kind of come back to, and I get ahead of what, kind of Chuck and Mark and everyone else has mentioned, is that I do think it's worthwhile to have that identification of what you would need to cut. I think, we're all hopeful, and we should be hopeful. That's where all this is based on, but I think we also have to be responsible. And so I think, that responsibility is understanding and prioritizing what you would need to cut, and, trying to make it as easy as possible as early on. But I'm sure, and this is part of my question, I think it's rhetorical, you've already done the analysis as far as what could be next. And so, so again, probably more, again, it's a rhetorical question, is if, what we would do next if things do get worse. And again, maybe just to Mark's point, about, kind of utilizing free cash up into, kind of that, kind of 1.75 or 2 million, buffer, is, we should probably have a good, discussion about that piece. But I think, my other kind of question with that is, if things get worse, are these the first things that we unwind? Or do we have to make different decisions at that point? And again, so it's all kind of a ripple effect, but I guess that's, I hate to be the doom and gloom, but I just think it's something that I think we have to, identify and prepare for. That's it.
Thanks, Ed. Jean, I see you next up.
Hi, everybody. I have a couple of thoughts that I just wanted to share. And to hear the chair of the school committee's perspective was really helpful to me, and I was frankly happy by it. I think that approach from the school committee is a really thoughtful one, to look at the proposed cuts and see which ones really aren't impactful to student learning and that can be sustained reasonably well, but which ones are going to hurt and which ones are not smart in the long term to make. So I really appreciate Chuck's thoughtfulness in what he brought here tonight. And the reason I say that is I want to agree also with what Paula Perry said. I agree with her. I've been doing some reading since our last meeting, kind of about what kind of a recovery people are predicting. And the fact is nobody knows. but I'm not finding a lot of people who think we're going to bounce back in 6 months. You know, is it going to be a W? Is it going to be a U? Is it going to be slow? But I am concerned that the impact could be greater over the long term. And I think building a budget that reflects that is smart. So I think using all free cash isn't a good idea. So I'm aligned with that line of thinking. The only other thing I think I would add is if we put back money to the school budget to a certain level to fund important priorities, I think we should have a conversation about putting back proportionally the same amount to the town budget. I think the cuts were somewhere around 60-40. So they were a little heavy on the town side, but not insanely heavy to that 2/3, 1/3 split. Like it's about what we typically do. But I think it's worth at least a discussion about ensuring that we maintain sort of the tradition in our town that when there is good financial news, we share it proportionately. But when we have to make cuts, we make the cuts proportionately. That's something I'd like to have a discussion about. And the only other thing I'll add to that, my thinking behind that, I was really impressed to learn that the school department shared their nurses with the town side when contact tracing needed to have happening. That's a resource that belongs to the schools. It was given to the town freely when that need was there. The fact that these cuts fall a little bit more to the town side than the schools is frankly typical of what I've seen over the years. The town is very quick to recognize when school needs are important and find a way to make it work, particularly in crisis. And I just wanted to say that's the kind of town I want to live in. So good job for everyone.
Thank you, Jean. Hi, Andrew. Let's see, you're up next.
Hi, how's it going, everyone? First, I want to just say thank you to everyone for last week's meeting and all the work that was done to get put into that. I want to just go back and clearly state I was pro or for the use of free cash, but to a certain extent that it was more so related to what Mark was saying. If the free cash, if we keep it in each one of the budgets and we don't end up using it, it ends up coming back to free cash anyways, right? So essentially it's, if we use the free cash and it comes back to us or we don't use it, is kind of the theory that I was getting at after further review of the additional information that Bob put out and watching the school committee meeting the other night. I would have to say that I have to agree both with Nick, Ed, and pretty much what everybody else is saying with keeping the COLA for the non-represented employees as well as the HR position. But that also being said, to reiterate what Jean was saying about the town and the administrative services, if I'm not mistaken, Bob, had the biggest chunk of that percentage. Is that in Public Works? Is that correct?
Public Works, certainly because of seasonal laborers, was a big chunk. And
Yep.
then administrative services did cut an HR position that's unfilled in half, more or less.
So to add to the similar question that schools probably brought up internally, and we've been discussing the loss of that potential new HR position, do you think that affects you further down the road? Do you think it would benefit you more to keep that open, like with the schools? I'm
gonna answer a question I'm not sure you asked, and then maybe the one you asked. I'm
Okay.
certainly very supportive of restoring the school HR position first and foremost. Aside from that being the right thing to do, there's no question there will be some spillover work to town hall if that position is cut. So just selfishly, we always want redundancy and backup, especially in key functions. I'm pretty comfortable with all the cuts that we made. It would be difficult for me to face our HR department if I didn't ask that we restore that position, which only cost about $20,000, and I don't think we have to ask for a 60-40 restore, but the 20 would be fine. But just to remind FinCom and others, the restoring that you're contemplating, I don't object to. But to be fair, these are things we can't cut in the middle of the year. If we hire someone for HR, we're not about to just get rid of them. if we, put a 1% COLA, I don't object to that, but we can't undo it. So we would have to find other things. And John and I have worked on that, and we have other lists. I'll give you a real simple example, which, feels a little disingenuous, but we could cut 60 or 120,000 right away by not buying 2 police cars next year. We could buy 1 or none. That's not a real long-term sustainable thing, but it would work for FY21. So I just wanted to mention that, again, I don't object to the things you're talking about. I'm not looking to make the town whole. I appreciate Gene's comments. The school HR position is the most important one on the table.
I guess to go off of that, Bob, I'd be in support of maintaining that COLA, maintaining the HR position with schools, and actually even adding the redundancy with the town and maintaining the HR position with the town. As far as making up the difference, we are healthy in free cash. I wouldn't like to personally suggest that we make up the full budget with the free cash, but instead the differences that COLA HR from both the town and from schools get made up with free cash. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. Tom, please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. At the risk of playing a little bit of the contrarian tonight, I'm going to throw a couple other things on the table from a discussion perspective. First, I want to echo what everybody else has said, that there's nothing negative here about the process to date. Obviously Bob, Gail, Sharon, John have done a great job looking at every little detail they possibly can. So, I echo the thanks in that space. I do agree with the HR payroll assistant and keeping that one in place for various different reasons. I think next year, one of the things we haven't talked about yet, but we're highly likely to see an increased number of substitute teachers next year, for example. We haven't talked about it yet, but for example, the CARES Act does not have a sunset date until this crisis is gone. And that allows for teachers to be gone for long periods of time. If they have to take care for a sick child or something else along those lines, or nurses or custodians or anything else along those lines, right? So we're not accounting for some of those unknowns, really, in some of these things. But I think an HR payroll assistant will help in some of that in terms of the hiring process, the paying process, the processing process, for lack of a better way to say, in those things. So I'm supportive of that. Where I start to diverge a little bit from what I'm hearing so far is the COLA side of it. No disrespect to anybody who would be getting it. And I can't begrudge them be getting it. What I'm thinking of is the wider town, though. One number I saw recently was 20% of Reading is now unemployed. And if that number is true, then we're saying, but the town staff will continue to get their 3% increase while 20% of our town is unemployed. Obviously, hopefully they rebound, going back to the V or U concept that's been discussed before, but it's hard for me to say, yes, you guys are going to get a COLA type increase. Who knows what COLA is really going to be, because most of these COLA increases aren't really the cost of living increase. They're not tied to any index of any sort necessarily. They're just a number, right? So you're going to get this increase, but 20% of your neighbors are now potentially unemployed as a result of this issue. So that's my pause when it comes to the COLA. I understand why people are asking for it or saying it's something that we put back, but that's my pause. I think it's a bad optics, for lack of a better way to say it. And so that's my concern there. Now, to go the opposite side of this conversation, and one of the reasons why I put forward the motion I put forward on Thursday is there's so many things we just don't know. We just don't know. We almost could expect we're going to have lost revenue in sports, extracurricular, and full-day kindergarten. If we go to a halvesy model or a full remote model, you can almost expect that all 284 kids that are registered for full-day kindergarten are going to unregister for full-day kindergarten. And then what's the impact of that from a revenue perspective and the offsets in the budget? That's a huge number that we haven't talked about yet. You got to talk about additional costs as well. I already mentioned substitutes. We can expect we're probably going to need some more counseling. We should probably be planning on more tutoring. We've done our best with regards to remote learning, but we've essentially lost 3 months of education. And yes, the bar has been reset. But we need to figure out what we're going to do to catch these kids up, and that likely means we need to consider things like more tutoring. Again, we don't know what next year is going to look like from a remote or in place or partial 50-50 type model, but the remote learning needs are likely going to be higher. We have, as Gail has pointed out, the $98,000 that we got as part of the CARES Act funding. Some of that has to be shared with AP and a few other places, so $80,000 give or take. But we just don't know. Compensatory special education services, how much is that going to cost? Free reduced lunch, we can expect that to go up with the 20% number I mentioned before. So really, I guess my concern here is we're reducing budgets and we're undercutting what we know we're going to have to spend. I know is maybe the wrong word. What we can expect in this environment, we're going to have to spend to keep services and support our students, our faculty, our teachers, etc. in the environment we're going to go into. I didn't even talk about cleaning because hopefully it's covered by Joe's budget, but we don't necessarily know for sure that it is. So, I applaud that we're trying to prioritize. I guess where I'm having a challenge, and this is what I said to John, what I've said to Chuck, is we seem to be putting savings ahead of knowing what the expenses are. And I understand that you're trying to do the best you can with the best information you have, but there are just so many unknowns. And I would prefer to have flexibility, personally, for Gail and John and others to address things and move that money to the places where it needs to go, rather than urgently and quickly go back to November town meeting. I expect we're probably still going to have to go back to November town meeting, but I don't want to go back and say, yeah, we cut a bunch of money, but now we're going to ask you for a bunch more. I think there's an optics question there as well that we're going to have to face. So, it's the best information with what we have, and I appreciate everybody's effort. This is why I put the effort, the motion I put forward, which was basically to leave the budget as it was. And I understand the compromise that's put forward. I can get behind the compromise that's put forward. I just want us to be aware of all the things that we haven't talked about yet, all the unknowns that are likely going to cost us to lose revenue and therefore lead to a big change in the budget numbers. So.
Thank you, Tom. No, it's thought-provoking, and we are operating in the fog of COVID. Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So I had 2 points that I wrote down that I wanted to share. One is kind of a summary point, more like to try to summarize where I think we are with respect to this discussion. And the second is a new idea that I heard from last week from Bob, and I wanted to put back out there. So the first point is that, as I understand where the committee is right now, the finance committee is deciding what budget to recommend to town meeting. And part of this, so the school committee has already voted a budget. Because of the change in circumstances, as I understand it, we're not, to be clear to everybody, we can't touch that school committee budget. We can, as FinCom, we can only vote or recommend vote to recommend to town meeting a different bottom line number for the schools. So as I understand it, the schools will retain the flexibility if we do that tonight, if we recommend a different number that's smaller. The school administration, as I understand it, is still free to move money as they think best for the schools and the students within cost centers, and the school committee is still free to move money between cost centers or within cost centers, all of the above, right? So we're not hiring a payroll assistant for schools. We're not changing the 1% cut that we talked about for schools. We're simply recommending an amount of money that would allow the school committee and the superintendent to do that if that's what they want to do, right? Do I have that right on the school side?
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Okay.
Somebody please correct me if I'm wrong.
So that's fine. So we have that flexibility. We're on the town side. Last point here. So on the school side, I think I've written down $60K additional funds that could be used for an HR payroll position, $53K that could be used to reverse a 1% cut in non-represented employees, if that's what the school committee chooses to do with it. We want to act responsibly and collaboratively, but ultimately it's not the finance committee's decision what they do with that, if town meeting were to appropriate that money. On the town side, it's a different matter, right? So if we're talking about $35,000 for a half year for a 1%, for not having a 1% cut, or $70,000 for full year And the third option idea I heard was keeping a half HR position. I think Bob said earlier, maybe Sharon, for 20,000. So those were the numbers I heard on the town side. We vote each of those line items as a finance committee to recommend those to town meeting, who of course, can do what they think best. But it's not like the town can move money from, oh, we're going to hire a half HR position or we're going to have the 1% cut restored in the second half of next year. We're committing as a finance committee to recommend one or the other, correct?
The town would certainly have much more difficulty making a different decision than what we're talking about tonight, just because there's so many lines. If part of the 1% COLA restoration is $7,000 to administrative services, there's really not much else we're going to do with that $7,000.
Right. So I just wanted, we're spending a lot of time on the details on the school side, and I see the purpose of that is to get the bottom line number right, as right as we can get it collectively for our town, acknowledging the uncertainty. Whereas on the town side, I haven't heard as much discussion about something that seems much more difficult to change or adapt to on the town manager side. So I wanted to flag that if people have questions about what finance committee should best do on the town side, we should have parallel level of detail. Okay, and that's my first point. And the second and final point is just Bob had brought up, I think, this idea of what I took to be kind of a reserve fund for finance committee to address the unknowns. That people have used that word a number of times, and I totally agree. We really don't know exactly what we're going to face between April and November. And so the idea of, do we have the right amount in a reserve fund or available if needed, so that finance committee could vote to meet needs that were really COVID related and really necessary to be met before that next town meeting? Do we have enough flexibility there? I know there's COVID everywhere in our budget, and we have changed all our numbers in light of that. But for the unknown unknowns, is everyone comfortable with that? Bob, I think it was 200,000. I can't remember the exact number, but is that the right number? It's a question for everybody, not just town manager, right? That I wanted to pick that point up. I thought it was a good point by the town manager, and I'm not sure what the right number is, but I'd rather aim high and regenerate more free cash and be able to reallocate that in November than aim low and be in a position where we have a line item in the town budget and we're kind of stuck within that when we don't want to be.
Yeah, Nick, it is 200,000. FinCom changed it from 150,000 a couple years ago. It had been 150,000 for 20 years. Really what the choice the town meeting will be asked is, would you prefer to give FinCom X number of dollars to work with, or would you prefer to have a special town meeting if it's required for those dollars? That's really the choice.
Right. And Nick, thanks for raising that. I did have that on my list to discuss tonight. It's a question of flexibility. Nick, did you have anything else?
No, thank you.
Chuck.
Thank you, Eric. I just wanted to just respond to Nick. Nick, as he knows, was on the committee, and that you are correct in your understanding of how our budget, the school budget, works versus the town budget. But I can say to you, as long as I'm around, it's not the way I roll. And if the FinCom says, we're restoring this money for these things, that's what they're going to. But you're right, and technically that could happen. It's probably happened in the past. It may happen in the future, but it's not going to happen under this watch. So,
thank you, Chuck. Andrew, do you have another one?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of branch off of what Nick was saying. So currently it's 200, but Nick, I think you were getting at, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, I think you were getting at Bob, or really anyone, do you feel the need to increase that amount opposed to town meeting? And if so, what do you propose? What are you thinking would be an adequate number with the unknown unknowns? Is that what you were getting at, Nick? Right?
It's an open question for those with far more experience than me on this call. So I really don't know. It just strikes me as something that we're in an area of profound uncertainty. I don't know that we don't know what we don't know. And I think going back to schools, I think that will be a big change for this community. And I don't know what we will encounter at that point. And so it just, to me, September is end of August, right? It's kind of midway between April and November town meeting. I wouldn't want to be in a situation where we have to call a special town meeting and for something that, and that itself could be a risky from a public health point of view. So I don't have a proposal. I don't know what the right number is. I'm interested in, Bob had, I spoke to that earlier, but I'm interested in everybody's ideas. I don't know what, I just want to get other people's perspectives.
Right. So I guess it really comes to you, Bob, and what you foresee based upon, we actually loosely talked about this last meeting and the meeting before about increasing or suggesting an increase of FinCom reserves in order to allow more flexibility. I don't think we ever really nailed down a definitive number other than that 200. Bob.
I guess one thing I'll add is that FinCom reserves in the fall are less meaningful than FinCom reserves after the annual town meeting. Then they're vital. When this started in March, words that don't usually escape my mouth did, and I said, don't worry about the money. We'll figure that out later. Spend what you need to spend. And I'd say the same philosophy would probably apply to both John and I this fall, especially as school reopens, is we just have to do what we have to do. And then we square it up at November town meeting. The school budget per se will have only spent less than half of its money by November town meeting. So there's plenty of bottom line money there, even if they should come up with a pretty large number. And the town would do the same. I'm not sure. I can't really picture what line items would be hit so badly that we would have to come to you without any question. The facilities expense or the facilities core budget is probably the biggest budget we have. That's a single line item. And that's where we've been spending most of our money so far, like $250,000 or so. So it is a philosophical question with a difficult answer, but it's an easier answer in the fall than it would be in the spring. In the spring, if we're in the same situation next spring, I would want FinCom to have a pretty good reserve fund going into the rest of the year. I don't feel quite as obliged. I don't have a problem with it, but I don't feel quite as urgent about the fall. All it is FinCom has the control over free cash to a certain dollar amount, and town meeting has to just be comfortable with that. And it's up to you to really decide what do you think you're comfortable with.
Thank you, Bob. So I guess maybe later on in this meeting, Eric, we might want to jump into that a little bit deeper. Don't want to take up the time right now.
No, it's yes, we will get to it. We should get to it. All right, I don't see any more blue hands.
Eric, I just raised my hand.
Oh, Paula, please.
No, so Bob, I was wondering sort of the logistics, if we felt we wanted to support not changing the COLA for non-employee municipal, because I know it's messy because it hits every line item. Is there any clean way to do that?
I've got a spreadsheet open that corrects many wage lines, so I've already got that ready for you, just in case.
Okay. Just asking.
So we'll open it up to, and please, anybody can raise their hand again and jump in at any time, but I would just open it up to the Finance Committee here for further thoughts, questions, impressions on everything we've discussed.
So I'm interested in the discussion about giving FinCom a little bit more authority over FinCom reserve fund. I like, Bob, if I understood what you said, I liked how you framed it. It's really a question of how much extra authority is town willing to give finance committee in this environment. And that's a question for town meeting. They'll decide it, but it's maybe a discussion we should have. The flexibility that might be called for. The one thing that's been certain throughout this conversation is everyone's level of uncertainty. I've heard really good questions raised about cleaning, PPE, technology, and stuff we're not even thinking of, substitute teachers. And there's just, I don't think anyone has their arms around exactly what this is going to look like. So I could certainly see an argument for an increased reserve for FinCom. But I think the communication of that is in light of this unprecedented circumstance. I think it's a worthy discussion.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that, so why don't we could linger there. I mean, it strikes me as a balance here between, I agree with Gene. I think there's a really strong case here to make, or a strong rationale behind, increasing the reserve fund to some degree. To me, it strikes me as a balance among flexibility, the authority control piece, right? Who's got control over the dollars, or they're granting us control to a certain extent. And then also Nick mentioned it too. There's the safety logistical piece, right? Should we need a special town meeting, how easy is it to convene one and get everybody together? Are we live? Are there safety issues still present? Are we back in however we're going to do it in June? So I think that's factored into it as well. So the question is, if we do, well, let me stop there. Any other comments, questions from the finance committee on that piece, on the reserve fund? What do you guys think?
Well, I think it is a good strategic idea to increase or propose the increased flexibility of use of reserve funds in light of the cuts that we're proposing to make potentially, right? So if we end up coming up short between now and then, it increases the flexibility without depleting the reserve fund if needed. I will say right now we're talking about a lot of what ifs. I think I heard Tom bring up unemployment numbers and percentages, which are going to be inflated due to the stimulus that's currently going on in the COVID-19. So it's hard to kind of gauge trending at this point. That also goes along with Governor Baker's address that he had this afternoon, and what everyone's going to have to be following with new guidelines. And those guidelines for phase 3 and phase 4, those aren't 100% published or even out yet. So what we're seeing right now is, we have hand sanitizer, disinfectant, all these miscellaneous cleaning supplies that right now we know we need. There's going to be some strenuous things that come about, especially in part of like the Board of Health with food services, and specifically I'm speaking of schools, but I think increasing or proposing to increase the reserve budget with the town will allow us to make a decision on without having to call a town meeting, I think is necessary. And I also believe the town will understand, because it is unprecedented times, and they know it is every day it's fluid with changes. So.
Yeah. Anybody else in the finance committee?
I would certainly agree as well with, sorry, this is Sean Jacobs from the finance committee. I agree as well with the idea of increasing that reserve amount beyond 200,000, given where we are today and sort of the unknowns and the flexibility that offers. I also agree with the idea of communication around that. And so I'm just sort of curious if that increase is something that becomes part of the policy in perpetuity, or is there a way to, given we're really discussing about this, given sort of the nature of where we are with COVID today, having this be sort of something that is just in existence for FY 21, but then potentially revert back to the 200,000 moving forward after that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Sean. I don't know if it's exactly a matter of policy; it's more budget. But point point's well taken. It certainly goes into the communication around this, the messaging around this. It's a special circumstance type of increase, and
that's right.
We look to potentially revert back to, if not 200,000, a lower level going forward.
Yeah, this policy, I'd like to, if we did do that, and I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's an insurance policy, but to Bob's point, it is a timing issue. If we have a problem between now and before November town meeting, that's a big problem. Yeah. We're spending a whole annual budget in, a third of the year kind of thing, right? Because that's, otherwise we'll just shore it up at November town meeting. But I do think, why not give us some flexibility? But understand, I do think we want temporary, because us increasing that amount then impacts the operating budget. It's got to give somewhere, it's got to balance. So you're taking that money from somewhere, even if it's just us holding it for flexibility. In the long run, we're impacting the operating budget. So I'd want to see it be temporary if we increase it.
Point from the Finance Committee.
So do we have a number that we want to recommend? It sounds like there's a majority of people that are in favor of it. Should we start to pivot to a number on that?
Yeah, I mean, so looking at the packet from last time, if I'm reading this correctly, Bob had said the town anticipates spending about $250,000 in FY21 on related expenses related to COVID. So maybe one way to go about this is to start with that number. That's baked in, but could that be 50% more or 20% more or whatever it is? So increasing, say, 100,000. With an eye toward, funding COVID-related expenses if we need to, would mean, if I do my math right here on the fly, that those expenses ended up being 40% more than what we're anticipating at this point. It does increase our reserve fund by 50%, but it's a starting point for conversation. If I throw out 100,000, how does that strike? How does that strike you?
This is Nick. Eric, I think that's the number that came up in conversation last week as well. And my two thoughts on that, to the communication point that John raised, if it's really, really high, there's an accountability question with town meeting, right? Like we say $4 million, it's a non-starter, I think. But if it's too small, what good does it do? Why bother? Right. And so it's like getting the point where you can really justify that, and to take the 100,000 as a starting point. And I don't know if that's too high or too low. I like the idea of pegging to this 250,000 that we baked in as a contingency, we being the whole, everybody involved in this proposed budget. So that's a good cognitive anchor, right? Starting with the 250, say, okay, this is what we thought the uncertainty, this is the number that we put on this uncertainty contingency, 250. And then I like the idea of going from that, well, are we 100% wrong? Are we 40% wrong? Are we 20% wrong? And then at the same time, reality checking that number against, well, what's enough money to make it worth the while? So that's one piece to, I like the approach of starting with 100. I kind of feel like between 100 and 150 is a fair range. I'd rather be a little generous if town meeting would allow it. Because it would just go right back into free cash. We're basically just taking out an insurance policy with free cash that we have authority to grab, allocate between town meetings, and then it goes back into free cash, right? So that's one point. And the second point around the messaging is, I wonder if we want to have it in the same line item. And I don't know, I'm not an accountant, so I'll say that up front. I could be saying things that are possible. But I'm wondering if we couldn't call it like a COVID contingency fund that would have a sunset to it intentionally, and saying, look, just until this, just for this budget cycle, just for this year, whatever it is, but we separately allocate the money. So we keep our traditional 200 or whatever it is in our reserve fund, and then we layer onto that some additional number for a COVID reserve fund. And we're accountable to town, well, we're presenting to town meeting saying, look, this money would only be, any use of this part of the money would have to be linked in some public and written documented way to defraying COVID costs. And it could be that it's only used for the COVID costs that we've already baked in, right? That you can only extend an existing change in the budget to spend more in a way. Like we thought it would be 10K to, I don't know, do X because of COVID, and it ends up being 15. So that's a good use of the extra 5 out of this COVID reserve fund. But what you can't do is use the money for we want to put in a new traffic light that has nothing to do with COVID, if it doesn't. So what do people think of that, both the messaging piece and the number piece? Those are my thoughts.
So I want to talk to you about the line item first. The finance reserve fund is a part of state finance law. You're going to want to stick with that. Certainly you can do your own accounting, and Sharon can help in terms of breaking up that number into more than one piece. And it's kind of a moral obligation how you spend it, but legally you want to call it FinCom reserves and have a grand total.
And this, Paul, I'm not, oops, sorry, I jumped in.
Go ahead, Paula, please.
I'm just not that worried about messaging. I think town meetings can totally understand. I don't think we have to overcomplicate it. I think town meeting gets it. So let's not overcomplicate it.
Yeah, and I'll echo what, this is Ed. I'll echo what Paula just said. I mean, the messaging piece of it, what I worry about with that, Nick, is that, okay, well, if you start into kind of getting into too much detail as far as, that it is COVID, but it's not, we're all talking about things that we don't know. So like, something brand new could come up that's still COVID related, but if you didn't spell it out, then you can't, that's the piece of it that I wouldn't, I think you get into, you end up kind of creating more issues than not, by trying to, over define it.
Let's see. Mark, you see your hand.
Thanks, Eric. Just maybe to add a drop more perspective to kind of where the numbers have been coming from in the past and why they were there in that reserve fund. I like the approach that you're taking. I think it should stay kind of in a single bucket. I remember one year, maybe it was only 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, where we actually needed to dig in pretty deep into that FinCom reserve. And I think we had 1 or 2 big issues that happened. My recollection is there was an overtime issue that we needed desperately, and maybe there was a boiler at the same time, whatever it was. They were uncertainties that had nothing to do with a pandemic, just to be clear, right? And so that's kind of where this notion of why it went from 150 to 200 is because as the budgets are getting bigger, that still is kind of the in the range of possibility of just kind of weird things that might happen. And clearly we're in a different time right now where there's this very unknown that's out there. And I think creating the opportunity to address it directly with a number such as what you're talking about, and that maybe 300 or wherever the total is, I think it makes good sense. I also agree that I think town meeting is going to understand that this is a different time. It does have some extra needs beyond things that we've ever seen before. And I think that that's a very reasonable approach to it. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Chuck, please go ahead.
Yes, I was going to go in a little bit different direction with this. So the FinCom Reserve Fund is for unexpected emergencies, right? Like a boiler goes down or something that we didn't know about. We know about this now. We know about COVID-19. And it is true that you don't have to go to town meeting to get money out of the FinCom Reserve Fund, but it still requires a gathering of the FinCom. I'm thinking, and Bob can correct me if maybe I'm going down the wrong road, but I'm thinking if maybe we set up a community priority fund for COVID-19 expenses, that makes the town manager and the superintendent a little more nimble in terms of being able to get at that money, as opposed to calling the FinCom together to vote on a FinCom reserve fund authorization. So again, this isn't something we don't know about. We already know about it. why not set up a community we already have the community set up a line item in that budget to cover COVID-19 expenses. So,
Sharon, I mean, that's pretty straightforward from a budgetary.
I think Sharon better answer that one.
I don't know that you could do that, because it's not voted as a line item within, I guess you probably could vote a separate line item, but then what do you put there? Town stuff, school stuff? I don't know.
well, don't we already have a community priority line item?
We do. It's 220,000, Chuck. Page 25 of the warrant.
But that's not really a line the town meeting votes on, though.
No.
That's a mechanism to get it into a line the town meeting votes on.
Isn't it part of accommodated costs?
It is, but town meeting, again, doesn't vote on those types of lines. I think the only difficulty you'd run into is I don't think we can put a pile of money out there that both the town and the schools have access to. I think because of ed reform, the school budget has to be whole.
Okay.
So you could add it to the school budget, and then we can.
No, I'm just trying to make make you a little more nimble. That's all.
Right.
No, I appreciate the sentiment, the rationale. Sorry.
Eric, can I make a suggestion here?
Please.
So, in past discussions, we've talked and select boards talked, and there's been discussion around town meeting that's coming up is going to potentially create some risk for folks that attend. We're trying to keep it as slim and streamlined as possible. I'm hearing Bob suggest that this likely doesn't matter until November. We're going to have a lot of complicated things to talk about at town meeting around, the revenue projections and some of these other factors that these committees have been discussing over the last few weeks. I'm wondering if it's the right thing to do to maybe allude to the fact that at November town meeting we might be looking to adjust or you guys might, I should say, might be. Sorry, I'm forgetting who I am. You guys may be looking to adjust the FinCom reserves, but if it's not necessary between April and November, maybe it's best to kind of leave it off the agenda and keep things moving, given the nature of how town meeting is going to run this year.
No, thanks, Sean. Jean?
Thanks. That's an interesting point, Sean. I need to process that one a little bit because, well, part of me agrees with you. Like, if it isn't absolutely necessary, definitely take it off the table. There's another part of me that thinks it might be a conversation town meeting would want to have. What can we do as a community to ensure that we can address whatever unforeseen needs come up due to the crisis? So I don't know. I'd have to think about that a little bit. I'm generally supportive of the concept of adding money to the reserve fund temporarily. And Chuck made a point that I think is an important one, that as far as I know, any use of that reserve fund has to be voted on by the Finance Committee in open session. So there's a high level of transparency. If we tell town meeting this money is going to be used, is intended to address unforeseen costs or issues that may come up due to the COVID crisis, they're going to get to see whether we do that or not. There's a high level of transparency. So, and for that, the only other point I wanted to make is I really agree with Ed's point that I wouldn't be inclined to put any particular limits on exactly how we would use the money, because I think in a crisis like this, there can be a domino effect. So because of COVID, there was this unforeseen cost that maybe not directly related to COVID, but it's indirectly related, and it's a cost we all agree needs to be covered. So I think just saying it's to address COVID and just highlight the transparency around how the money would be used in the event that we had to.
Yeah, and the increase, it gets tricky, right? Sorry. Thinking out loud, but wasn't ready to be out loud. Andrew.
Yeah, so I guess my question kind of is collective as to what is the negative downside of putting a request out there to increase the FinCom reserves, knowing that if we're just talking about bringing it to town meeting. Town meeting might say no. You know, I don't think there's really any adverse side effects or secondary responses that would happen by requesting an increase of reserve funds not to exceed, you know, $325,000 for the period of FY21 to FY22 with the reevaluation of the reserve funds in the spring of FY22. Or some type of quality control there, because just like the unknowns, if we say, hey, we want to reduce that back down to 150 or 200 in 12 months, right? We might be saying, hey, we need to actually keep it because we have a second run of the pandemic that happens in the fall, or whatever it might be. I think raising it now or raising it in November, yeah, we'll need it more in November, but I don't think that really makes a difference of bringing it up now, engaging where the community and the town is at with hearing the increase of the FinCom reserves.
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. The only one that springs to mind for me is, I think, what Sean was alluding to. It might complicate the conversation a bit, just since when there's already a lot to talk about. But you know, my inclination is to, you know, it certainly fits in the conversation. It's a very reasonable ask. That's where I seem to be landing right now. Nick, Nick, go ahead.
Just to try the other side out for.
Please.
Just for a thought exercise here. So to Sean's point, and I think Bob mentioned this earlier, what would have to happen for FinCom to need that money before November? Number one. And number two, how sure are we that the November town meeting will be able to occur on schedule? Right. So those two kind of go in opposite directions, right? So April town meeting's already delayed. We don't know what November is going to look like. So that's the point. We're assuming we're going to have a November meeting. We'll have a meeting. Will it be in November? I really don't know for sure. So what would have to happen FinCom to need these funds, this insurance policy we talked about? I guess in a line item, we would have to be so dangerously low spending in less than half the year we've spent to a point where the remaining balance is critical, right? It would be, we've spent, as a town, we've spent whatever for any given line item. The balance has gotten so critically low that we can't continue to fund operations throughout the fiscal year. Is that the trigger for using this, or is it something else?
Bob or Sharon?
Yeah, I'll start. For this spring, I don't know if you remember, but way back in March when you met, thank you, you voted $75,000 into the town manager reserve fund, and that's similar to the discussion we're having now, so that would pay for any town expense. And it's not that I move the money to all the different lines, it's just that we pay for the whatever it is out of that line. Since the budget in front of you doesn't have the flexibility with a big number there, you would really need to come to FinCom when a relatively small number is in danger of being overspent, and probably would be, let's just say, by the middle of the year. You know, your question, Nick, on November town meeting is an excellent one. No one knows. You know, if the fire department suddenly ran into a lot of expenses, the public safety expense budget is relatively small. So if they had 100,000 or 150,000 of some kind of expenses that we couldn't foresee, that might be one of the few examples I can think of where they would have to come to you before the middle of the year, or, you know, in the first half of the year. It would be unusual.
Nick, any follow-up to that?
No, I'm more interested what other people in the committee think of this, because to me it's an interesting puzzle. I could see one argument is, well, what do you need to use it for? We're going to have a meeting in November. The other side is, we don't know if we're going to have a meeting in November or December or January. We don't know for certain. We could call a special meeting. There's a public health cost to risk to doing that. And these smaller items in the town budget, as Bob said, they don't have a whole lot to absorb a big contingency that on a lot of the town side. The schools have more flexibility to move money around within their budget within the school committee, but the town is going to be voted as town meeting votes. So, what are other people's thoughts?
It was a good point about the possibility of November date being impacted. I don't really see a negative to putting 100,000 into reserve, additional into reserves. I'm just throwing that 100 out. I don't really think there's a negative, and I think we just pick a number and go with it.
I agree. I just said, I think it's, I think at the end of the day, we know this. There's so many things that are unknown. This is what we've been talking about now for 2 meetings. There's so much that's unknown. We do know that we have a town meeting set up. Let's just use it. Who knows what's going to happen in November? There's so many things we don't know. Let's just go with what's known and what we can decide upon now in order to, kind of present there. I've lost track as far as, who's proposed what. I think 100,000 is probably, the number I've heard most. I think that's, just like anything else, I think everything is light, but, again, so I think that as a minimum is probably, fine, again, because again, getting back to the opening thought, everything's so unknown, but I think 100,000 is fine, and I wouldn't be opposed to anything above that.
Any other viewpoints from the Finance Committee, both on the question of if we should make this request of town meeting and on the amount proposed of 100,000?
I'll agree to that. I agree. Minimum 100,000, and to propose it to increase the town meeting.
I'm comfortable with it as well.
Are there any views on a number other than 100,000? Seems reasonable to me, but I'm interested in everybody's perspective.
Again, I'm in favor as well, and the 100,000 seems like a reasonable number here, given not only as it relates to a percentage of the current FinCom reserve, but also, as Eric alluded to, is it some of the line items for potential expenses that we were anticipating because of COVID.
Okay, I'm hearing a consensus from the committee that we will incorporate that increase of 100,000. If there are no other viewpoints on that, I suggest we move the conversation on. I do want to get to the question of there's a conversation I have here around the use of free cash. Circling back to taking up the what I'm hearing is I think a consensus from the school committee on their position on the HR payroll administrator, the broader stated position on the COLA cuts. Before that, just glancing at the other areas of cuts, proposed cuts, that really we didn't discuss last week, and I haven't heard discussed tonight. Just to make it explicit, are there any viewpoints from the committee, or anybody for that matter, around the proposed cuts to pension assessment, snow and ice, around the capital plan, the OPEB contribution? Those areas, again, are particularly the capital plan, the OPEB contribution, are sizable. Any viewpoints there, thoughts on those proposed cuts from anybody in the committee? Again, or anybody?
I guess this is Ed. First question I had is that, kind of given how, kind of Chuck, kind of started us off, with the school committee, has anyone since when did we meet last Thursday? Has anyone had any more considerations as related to either of those for us to consider? Rather than kind of debating the first point, if someone already has a different view of it, let's understand that before we, so we can kind of go with what's current.
Fair.
So on the, I should raise my hand, Eric, sorry.
Go ahead now.
On the OPEB question, so one thing in the warrant, it seems that the meeting increased the actual FY19 quite a bit. So it was 500K in FY18, went up to 800 in 19. And then now I think it's, with these cuts, is it 500? Are we going back to FY18 levels? Am I reading this right, or was there changes from the document that I'm looking at? Looking at what I think is the proposed warrant.
Eric,
Back to 500.
Yeah, the 800,000 was because there was a surplus at annual town meeting from health insurance. The base number was somewhere in the 500,000s, 525, 550. This year we started at 500, a little bit lower than the current year because the pension jump was so large. And what I've suggested is you actually chop that down to 100,000, almost just a token amount left. Thinking that in the middle of the year, you can always do whatever you want to do or ask town meeting to do. If there's free cash, you can always ask town meeting to increase that. But what's in front of you is a $400,000 cut from 500 to 100. And the pension number, that would require another meeting of the pension board and a revote. They have revoted the 25% increase instead of a 31% increase. In terms of optics, I would have said, that's several red flags going to town meeting in this situation. So the 25% seems, it's not going to get any higher and pass, I guess I'll say.
Yeah, I agree on the optics point. And Nick, yeah, that was a conversation before you came on board. We had the opportunity to go bigger there, to begin to address that liability. But in my mind, given everything, it makes sense to pull that back.
Agreed.
Anything else? Yeah, please.
So I did have a few questions. I guess this is somewhat to Bob on a few of the capital reductions. One of them was 25,000 administrative services deferred wiring project to FY22. Is this the same wiring project we were talking about on the previous meeting that had to do with the police department and so forth, Bob?
No, it's not.
Okay.
A year or so ago, maybe it was last fall, the town and the schools put in some money, $250,000 for the schools, $25,000 for the town, for wiring that were not directly related to building security. That's a separate project. What I've suggested is that $50,000 stay in the school budget because they need to do an assessment of what to spend and how to do it, and that the 200 for them gets pushed out a year. And I'm not sure that we'll need the 25,000, but just to be simple, I asked to push that out 1 year. So there's no harm in, on the town side, certainly, of that 25,000.
Now, my second question to that would be, I guess, more so related to everyone. Maybe the select board might have a better gauge on the community, but the $100,000 reduction in the DBW roads, reduce sidewalk, curb, and skim coating by 50,000 each to 50,000 each. Do you think the town is going to gravitate towards that, or do you think there's going to be some pushback in related to that, or you don't think they'll one way or the other?
The way I've explained that to a couple of folks that have asked is we're cutting the numbers in half, and in the middle of the year, if we're in a position to restore the second half, then we'll just ask town meeting.
Okay.
I think that's pretty reasonable. It's not a permanent cut for the full year, until an opportunity goes by in the winter.
Okay. And then, I just want to make sure I understand the last portion right, is suspended to a 4.2% debt and capital, and then propose a back increase to 4.8 and then a 4.5. Do we want to talk about considering changing the floor of the debt and capital to like a 4.5. We've discussed this a few times. I don't know if it's something we want to discuss now, but
I think we got enough on our plate.
Okay.
I mean, it's probably a fair point, Andrew, and we've discussed it before, and you know, go ahead with this. Obviously, we're dipping below the 5. But again, it feels to me like you know, given everything, it's a lever to pull, a short-term lever to pull, and it makes sense. I'm not necessarily sure it becomes a new policy. And then just from a philosophical perspective, you know, so much good work has been done on capital over the years that it you know, it really doesn't concern me, again, above the detail level here to you know, have the capital dip down like this in these times.
Okay. So I guess the only reason I bring it up, Eric, is because if we keep projecting outward 5, 10, so forth, with the 5% debt and capital, it may be noted that we might want to set debt and capital because of the reduction in their line items, i.e. schools, towns, etc. They may want to change the vernacular from 4.2 to maybe even just an increase to 4.8 and then maintain it at a 4.8. But
yeah, I don't know if anybody else on the committee has a viewpoint on that. I guess again, totally fair, and a conversation worth having. I might suggest in the future a bit. That's my position on it.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Eric. I think it's an interesting conversation and a good one to have. I'd like some clarity on the long-term impacts of COVID on our revenues before having it. So I think a year from now, we're going to have a little bit more clarity on what's going on with state aid, on Chapter 70. Then we can have then I'm very interested in a conversation about, is 5% the right number? Should it be something else? I just think, given all the uncertainty right now, I wouldn't want to look at a policy that's existed for decades or well over a decade in this environment, just because I feel like there's so much we don't know. And related to that, I did want to share, Eric, I was really glad that you brought up the issue of capital and the OPEB funding and some of the costs that we haven't talked about so much. And, I view this as a crisis budget. When you don't know what the future brings for the next several months, it makes sense to me that you look at what can you put off, what can you not do to keep everything going until you have that clarity, which we'll have, I hope, in 6 to 12 months. So I'm generally comfortable with this, just generally comfortable with the approach that was presented by Bob and John and everyone else.
This is Sean Jacobs again. I would echo exactly what Jean said, and Eric, I appreciate you bringing these items to the discussion here. Just sort of like some of the other comments that have been shared, I too just sort of viewed these as I don't want to say the cost of doing business, but just sort of the reality of the situation that we're in. And so these didn't come to light for me in much of the same way that things like the H-roll payroll administrator position did. So again, just I acknowledge these are here, but again, I think it's just the reality of where we are today that having these reductions in capital makes sense. And
No, thanks, Sean. I just want to make sure they were explicitly discussed.
Yep.
Bob, that's your hand.
Yeah, I just want to tell you some somber news that you'll be asked to meet in 4 months to start discussing all this. We'll probably need a September financial forum this year. So it's not that far away when we start thinking about the FY22 budget. Hopefully we know a lot more in September, but.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay. Well, I wonder if we unless somebody would like to take it in a different direction, I wonder if we turn the conversation toward the use of free cash, the current proposed 500,000, or would we want to make any adjustments to that given what we've heard from the other boards, their position? just where I'm coming down, I completely respect the viewpoint and sympathetic with the potentially providing the funding back for the school committee to use, obviously as they see fit, but would be for the HR payroll administrator, and then across both sides on the 1% COLA cut. I completely appreciate the rationale that's been put forth. I guess I would say, in the proposed plan to address the budget cuts, I think short term and longer term have been matched up pretty well. This would be a bit of a deviation from that if we use free cash to fund, we're using free cash to fund operating expenses in this case. And it could very well be that we decide that's the right thing to do and the best thing to do. I just would want to make that explicit. It's a departure, I feel, from the way we normally use free cash. But a lot of what we're doing is departure from the norm here.
Yeah.
Would open that topic up to conversation, again, from the Finance Committee, but anybody else who wants to chime in.
So, Eric, this is Ed. So are we at this point just talking about the 500, or are we talking about, and if my math's right, someone's going to have to correct me, the 668, if we add in HR for the schools, which was 60, HR for the town, which was 20, the COLA for the schools, which was 53, and the COLA for the town, which was 35.
Yeah, and thanks, Ed. I think we're talking more broadly around the use of free cash. Mark framed it up well earlier, providing some historical background. I think this year we're at, coming into this conversation, we're at 1.25 million. Are we comfortable with another 500,000? Are we comfortable, increasing it to include everything that you just mentioned, Ed? Just generally, how do we feel about how we want to use free cash in this conversation? So the short answer to your question is all fair game for discussion.
Yeah, so I'll start. I mean, again, I think this gets back to, all of the thought that went into it in the outset. I think there's, everyone contributes, you kind of pull from everywhere. And so I think from that perspective, having, more come from free cash, makes sense. And it is frankly the most responsible thing that's, or it just highlights the responsibility that's in this, because the conversation could have been all of it, all of the budget cap, kind of coming out of free cash. So we're already talking, from a position of, increased responsibility, and frankly from strength, because we could have easily have had, kind of a easier conversation, because we could have, kind of absorbed it from free cash. So I think from that perspective, and getting back to what Mark said, much earlier, even at adding the 668, you're still under, you're in between that 1.75 and 2 million. So I think from that perspective, I endorse it, just because in light of all of the options, this is, really frankly a metered one, as far as the use of free cash.
Yeah, I actually agree with Ed.
Don't sound surprised, Gene. That's not a bad thing.
Get used to it. I think in this instance, this is the responsible thing. I also think it merits saying that we're incredibly lucky to be a town that has that's built up the free cash reserves that we have. We have this option available to us in a crisis to keep things moving until there's some clarity around future revenue. That being said, 1.75 up to $2 million in free cash is completely unsustainable in any kind of long-term plan. So we might be having a really difficult conversation in 6 or 12 months. But I like to think if we have, and I'm hopeful that that's not the case. But if we do, at least I'm hopeful that we'll be having it with more understanding of what the real impact is that we have today. So I'm comfortable with this proposal.
I agree with you, Gene, and that we'll have much more data at that point, and having much more data, I have a lot of faith in Bob, Sharon, Gail, and John to kind of analyze that and then be able to kind of tackle that, having more data in 6 to 12 months.
Just to clarify the numbers though, aren't we looking at if we did the COLA, the HR payroll admin, aren't we looking at between 183 or 203? Or isn't it 70,000, Bob, for the COLA issue on the municipal side?
I had 35.
Paula, I wrote down 5 numbers.
Yeah.
Schools 53, town 35. Schools 60 for HR, town 20 for HR. And don't forget, you just gave yourself 100,000 in your reserve
Exactly.
fund. You can take that
Right.
from free cash.
Right, so that's another
So
100.
it could
Oh,
be
so the
potentially-
35, so that's, the 35 puts it back. Okay, I thought the 70 was required. Okay.
So, round the school number to 55 and you're talking about 270,000 more free cash. That includes your reserve fund.
That's right.
Is the 35 for 12 months or 6 months on the town side?
6 months.
6 months.
Yeah, 6 months.
So I had the same question. Like, what is the number? If we take HR payroll at 60, 53 was the number I wrote down for the schools for not doing the 1% for the year, right? And the town was 20 for HR and 35 for 6 months. So it'd be 70 for 12, right?
No,
Is it that simple?
Only took a cut of 35.
Yeah, what we did was we only cut 35.
Yeah.
If we didn't do any all year, we would have 35 surplus for the next year to base another cut on.
I have a historical question just with free cash. Does anyone have just kind of a pretty good people who've been around for a while? How much of free cash is the result of revenues happening to come in higher than expected, but expenses staying where they were expected to be, versus free cash generated by revenues being about what they should be, but overestimating our expenses, allocating a budget at town meeting, and then not spending the budget? Do you see the difference? Does anyone have a sense of what is free cash when we look at the total pile? How much of it is we guessed too high when we budgeted, or we guessed too low on the revenue side?
It's both, actually, and it's about equal. It's revenue and expenses. So we'll get more revenues than projected, and then we'll spend less in expenses than projected. And so it comes from both and almost equally. In a given year, we could regenerate $3 million, and it could be 1.5 on the revenue and 1.5 on the expense side. In recent years, it's been more than that. So it's just hard to know, especially when we have open positions. When we did the override, we had positions open for a period of time. We had a bigger regeneration year last year than we had in prior years, because we had, budgeted a full year for people that weren't there the whole year. So sometimes the expense will outweigh it, but most of the time I'd say that it comes from both directions, and it's unknowns. You don't know when people are going to leave positions, and positions are going to remain open, and that there's going to be turned back to free cash that wasn't expected. And it happens every year, and it's just never known how much of it there's going to be, but it definitely happens on both the revenue and the expense side. I do have a spreadsheet if you'd like to see of what free cash has looked like over the last 10 years. But it doesn't break down that number between expenses and revenue. It just calls it general regeneration. But you can see kind of the trend of where free cash is gone at that level. Let me see if I can pull it up.
Yeah, I'm more just curious from the standpoint of what we're talking about here is, the precedent of using more free cash, and the general, and I think very, very good rule about not using free cash for operating expenses. I totally agree with that. Against the reason why we're reaching into free cash or discussing it, as I hear it, is uncertainty. It's just that delta. Everything here is related to either, I think the HR payroll discussion is around a critical function, making sure that we have the capabilities we need in real time to get the work done. And then the other areas seem to be questions about equity around pay cuts in a difficult time, and questions around uncertainty with the additional reserve, right? So if we aim high, particularly on the reserve number, that automatically goes back into free cash anyway. We're kind of renting, not using necessarily. And if we need to spend it, we need to spend it. It's because there's a bona fide need, and it's a transparent use because the committee meets publicly. So those are my thought is I I think even for me, staying within the like $2 million guidance that Mark talked about is from his former experience on FinCom at the beginning, the 1.25 to 2 million range, we're still roughly within that range. We're in the high end of it if we were to add to the reserve, fund the HR positions, and not have the 1% decrease. So to me, that seems sensible unless someone has a different view that I think is persuasive. Thanks.
No, I'd have to agree with you, Nick, on that. I think it comes out to what, 768, somewhere around there, Bob?
Yeah,
That's right.
That includes $100,000 from the additional reserve funds.
So that puts us over 2 million.
As it puts us at 2.01.
2.018.
2.01. And
So,
sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to reiterate, I think the process of this has gone really well as far as the amount of work that everyone's put into this. And then when it got brought to us last week, a lot of us took a step back and said, hey, we have to make sure these are 100% necessary before we say, yes, we're going to go ahead in front of town meeting and present this reduced budget. That also allowed, the school committee to get together and us to have this conversation today. And people say, well, after reviewing what everyone said, we think we want to keep A, B, and C. And in conjunction with this meeting, I think it is a general consensus generally to keep the HR positions from both town and schools and keep the COLA for both town and schools. And we did an adequate review of some of the capital planning and debt. So I would be in support of that 768 increase while also providing that additional support to the schools in the town. That's it.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, so again, just back to the general rule of using free cash for one-time versus operating. So what we're talking about here is an extra 768,000. 500 of that was in the original proposed cuts for one time. 100 of that is the FinCom reserve fund, not operating expenses. Who knows how it gets used, but in theory, not operating expenses. So that leaves 168 of operating expenses. For me, I can get there with the HR payroll administrator positions. It's a question of, the question of risk there, I think, for me, outweighs the general rule of not spending free cash on operating expenses. I guess where I'm just not there yet is the COLA piece. That's not necessarily a risk question. It might be a different question, an equity question, perhaps. But for me, I'm just not there.
So Eric, just to jump in, this is Ed. I share that. I think it might have been something that Tom said. At one point. That's probably the one piece that I've had circled and starred and throughout the conversation tonight is that piece. That's everything else is kind of in full agreement, and that's the only one that's given me pause.
We talked about optics though, and I really hate going down that road. I don't get why we would differentiate union versus non-union and not be equitable. If the unions were going to come to the table and volunteer to say, we're a team here and let's do something, it'd be one thing. But I really don't like going down that road and treating non-union employees differently.
Yeah, I totally hear you and sympathize with that position. An alternative viewpoint could be a question of what we can control and what we can't necessarily, and this is one we can. But yeah, there's an optics piece to it, and that we're not saying that should be not part of this conversation.
Yeah, I'm looking at it less philosophically and just more numbers.
I'm sorry, Marianne, did you have, I'm just saying this now, I think this came through in the chat. Did you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, it's a little bit related to this, and following up on something Tom Wise brought up, where he mentioned about the unknown costs with tutoring and extended school year. And I was trying to think about those as whether those are going to be like one-time emergency costs, or do the schools foresee that these are costs that are going to get incurred beyond FY21? Like once we figure out these unknowns, we may have to compensate for the loss of whatever we're having now and into the fall through multiple fiscal years. So that's just another consideration with free cash and operating costs. I don't know if the schools have a sense of when unknowns come up, if they're going to be something that affects multiple budget years. That was just one thought on that. And then, do we think, I don't know if this is off in an odd direction, where we know at least some of the school unions are coming up for negotiation this year. Will it affect our negotiation either way?
We
if we're
really
keeping
can't
the
talk
1%?
about that, Marianne.
Yeah, no, I mean, in terms of optics, I guess it's just something to think about. I know you can't discuss this negotiation, but just in terms of, do the schools think that it would be recurring once we figure out what the unknown is, that it's going to affect us for like 5 years, 3 years, 1 year? And that's just was my thought.
Jack, do you want me to answer it? Eric, do you want me to answer it?
Sure.
Miriam, we really don't know at this point. I mean, it's one of those other unknown questions. We really won't know until we can get the students back in school and see what's going on.
I mean, is there anyone, are the educators, are your peers talking about this, or anyone in the industry saying, well, this is going to be something we have to address?
It's one of the many costs that we had on that slide at the school committee meeting the other night. It's just a part of the entire list that is an unknown.
Okay.
I think
I wouldn't even know how to quantify it.
Yeah, I can answer it as the non-superintendent. I don't see how the Commonwealth can open public schools if every city and town has to spend $1 million or more with new costs, and that it's not safe for the kids. Part of the decision to reopen schools will be a balance of what's sensible here.
Sorry, Marianne.
No, that's okay. I'm just listening. I'm done.
No, it's Jean. I just wanted to loop back to, I see the argument both ways on the 1% COLA. I really do. But I'm inclined to agree with Paula because of the uncertainty we're facing into. We're looking at a total cut or not cut of, I think, $88,000 when you're looking at the COLA. In a budget as large as ours, it's a relatively small number. And insofar as there are going to be long-term impacts on labor costs, I guess, I'd almost rather deal with those in 4, 6, 8, 12 months when we have a little clarity on what the future looks like. If we don't really know what we're looking at for the future, I don't like the idea of not adequately compensating one group of employees over another. So I tend to be aligned with the equity argument on this, but I absolutely see both sides of it.
Sharon, is that your screen presented? Sharon?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute for a second there. This is just a free cash estimate, just based on what we've had, or what we've talked about, what we've used and what we plan to use. And this was the number we were coming into this evening with, the $1,750,000, was with what Bob had proposed when he originally did the presentation.
this number would obviously change if you change things that were presented and go up. And it's just about how comfortable you are with that.
Thank you. Anybody have any questions on that, on what's presented there?
So Sharon, the negative number, this is Nick, the negative numbers in your spreadsheet under where it says town meeting votes reducing free cash for, and then you have current year, and there's negative number, and then below that you have subsequent year's budget. Can you just briefly explain to us what that means? Is that indicating that just that the budget allocated that amount of free cash, or does it indicate that the free cash was regenerated from a budget item that wasn't spent?
Sure, I'll explain the whole thing. So let's look at the top where you see fiscal year 2020, and that amount up at the top is the amount that was certified for free cash to start the year. And then I'm projecting on the next line down a regeneration number, and I usually project a very small number because it's hard to know, and especially in this environment, I'm not going to know for sure. So I'm giving you a regeneration number of 1.5 million for 2020, and that's just an estimate. And then down below, there's the uses of free cash since it's been certified. So in November, we used on 3 different articles, 186,953 of free cash. So one of those articles was the 1.2 million, I think it was, for the modulars, 35,000 for gas, the gas inspections that we were doing, and just modifying the current year budget. And then what was supposed to be April town meeting, which we're going to put off till June, we had $365,000 worth of proposed changes for the current year. And at April town meeting, we normally would vote the next year's subsequent free cash use. So that would fall in 2020, even though it's going to get used in 2021. And so I had placed the 1,750,000 there because that's the number we've been discussing, but obviously this is the number that you guys are working on this evening, and that will change potentially. The overlay surplus is usually part of this regeneration number. We turn back overlay and then we vote to use it, so they kind of wash each other out, but I just put them in because they are in the budget. And so it gives you an estimate of where you're going to be because it's showing you where your free cash was, how much you plan to regenerate, how much you've used, and what the math is. And so if everything happened as I show here, you'd be just under $13 million of free cash after all is said and done when we do the June town meeting. And going into fiscal 21 with somewhere around $13 million. And then the estimate here is kind of just what I project potentially could happen in 21. Based on what Bob has on his projections of using 1.5, that might change if we're using a bigger number. 1.5 for fiscal 22. We had talked at the last meeting of possibly putting back the capital at November town meeting or potentially adding back the OPEB at an April town meeting if things were to improve. So I just placed those numbers just to show kind of visually if we did all that we've talked about, where would we end up?
And Sharon, really rough numbers, what would you say the regeneration number on average has been for the last, let's say 7 years? Rough numbers.
These are the numbers. These are actual numbers up here. So let's see. Can't see it with all the pictures. Let me move you guys over there. So, okay.
Yeah.
What, 7 years or 5 years? How many years?
How about 7? Lucky 7.
Averaging $4 million.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
Our regeneration has been quite high since I've been here. I don't know. Prior, it seemed like it was much lower. So I don't know if we changed something, because you see in the prior years, it was all 1 million, 2 million. So, but we've been regenerating very high levels. We've been very fortunate for the last several years. And like I said, this number is a whopper, but it has to do with the override and having things budgeted for a full year. Weren't there the whole year.
So it sounds, what I'm taking away from this is that it's related to not spending money at the end of the year that was in budgets at the beginning of the year. Is that what you mean by 4 million in that amount per year, or am I misunderstanding?
Well, we project our revenues, and we tend to be somewhat conservative with our revenue projection because we don't want to ever have a revenue deficit where we have to cut budgets mid-year. So we're never aggressive about how we budget our revenues, but we're not overly conservative either. We're somewhere in the middle. So we almost always will have some regeneration related to revenues, because there are revenues that we don't budget for that almost always come in some fashion, like FEMA money. FEMA money doesn't ever come in for the year that the storm actually happened. You don't necessarily know when it's coming in, and then it just blesses you, and it hasn't been budgeted because you don't know it's coming. So we don't budget for items that we don't know are coming, and those things are almost always regeneration on the revenue side. We get Maya dividends and rewards for participating in safety trainings and things of that nature. They're not guaranteed, but they're potentially coming in every year, and they're varying in amounts. We're not going to project that because they're just not certain. So there's definitely pieces of our revenue that comes in pretty regularly, but in varied amounts, not guaranteed, that we don't count on, and those almost always help us build revenue regeneration. On the expense side, it's just a lot of, turnover. A lot of it's on the salary side. So you have people working and they leave you and you have a position being open for several months or sometimes longer, especially with the public safety arena. It takes a lot longer to replace somebody who's retired or whatnot. And so we end up with a lot of turn back on the expense side, at least on the town side, based on people just leaving and having the positions open for a period of time. So there almost always seems to be a good percentage of that causing regeneration. So,
and how much of it's been health benefits? Because we've been very fortunate there too. And it's a big bucket. So 1% is a big swing.
There's always a few $100,000, I think, in the end. It's like 200,000 or 300,000 in the end, but not. I mean, I feel like we use that at town meeting, and as we know the number is lower, because when we're building the budget, we don't know what the enrollment's going to look like. We don't know what the going to be, so we have to be very careful about how we project that number. And then by the time November town meeting or even April town meeting comes around, we know a lot more of that information and are able to pull from that line item for things that we've discovered that we need in other areas. And so we tend to, and so it never ends up being that a huge number is coming out of health insurance. Typically,
we know it before the end.
We pull it out before the year is done because we recognize there's extra there.
So Sharon, thank you for that. I mean, what I'm trying to take away from that, the $4 million number per year, that kind of 7-year average was really helpful. Again, kind of fact to have in my mind. What I'm trying to get at is like, if a typical year, and maybe there's no such thing as a typical year, but if the average numerically is like around 4 million regenerated per year, we're talking about pushing closer to 2 million. I'm just trying to get a sense of whether the total amount of free cash that we're thinking about proposing here, or by changing this budget number, based on the discussion tonight, is in the right ballpark. I get the sense that it is, but just one last question is, like, out of a 4 million, is it typical like 2 million from unspent budgeted expenses and 2 million from unexpected revenue, or is it closer to 4 to 1, or do we just not have any way to track that?
I definitely have numbers I could look up each year and show you, but it tends to be, from my recollection, somewhat split. So when I have a $3 million regeneration year, it's usually around 1.5, 1.5. It usually split down the middle, which is odd. And so I feel like it tends to, my memory seems to feel like it's more of a 50-50 split, probably not exact, but we do generate on both sides. The regeneration is coming from both sides. Like I said, I think it's just knowing that we have certain revenues that tend to come in that we don't know for sure are coming in, or what amount they're going to be coming in. So there's always a piece in the revenue that seems to be a good buffer to be there if revenues are kind of lagging where they're supposed to be. To have those buffers coming in is helpful. I think they're going to be very helpful this year because, with what's going on, we are seeing lagging revenues. We are at 96% collected for the year, but we've got 6 weeks left. And with the legislation saying, well, you don't have to pay till June 1st, it's hard to know. Are we going to get all the money? Are people going to not going to be able to pay the remainder?
No, I appreciate it. It's incredibly complex and uncertain. The simple thought I was going to with these questions was, it appears the free cash regeneration has a revenue piece, and that has a set of uncertainties we discussed at the last meeting and in some subsequent emails that Bob sent out. And then there's a spend piece where it could be turnover, it could be anything we allocate in a proposed budget that doesn't get spent ends up being regenerated, right? And there's a set of uncertainties there. And so what was helpful to me in thinking about this number that Eric put on the table, I think it was a 768, is where is that relative to the uncertain? Sounds like there's, just ballpark, 2 million of revenue that has certain uncertainties we talked about at the last meeting. Okay, I can put that over to one side in terms of not, how much free cash is the appropriate amount here. And then there's, ballpark probably around 2 million, maybe not, I don't know, we don't know, but historically 2 million on the revenue side where the town meeting tends to allocate about 2 million that ends up getting regenerated, right, through a variety of different places. So 768, close to $1 million is about half of either of those. To me, that feels right. So the total feels about right, and then this number of the 88,000 for the 1% cut, based on equity considerations versus kind of a bright line rule about not spending on operating expenses. That's a real tough call for me sitting here and thinking about it. I appreciate it's a small number in the grand scheme of maybe the much larger numbers I just talked about, but it is precedent setting, and if we are focusing on one group, there are many other groups and interest stakeholders here that are getting cut that we're not talking about. And so I'm still kind of on the side of the bright line rule, unless someone has, kind of other thoughts that I haven't had yet that they can share. I'm more with kind of where I think Ed and Eric were of, keeping, not doing the 88,000, not including an additional 88,000 for these pay cuts. Not because I don't care about people, I do. It's just there are many adversely affected groups, and not all of them are being discussed here. And we can't put the amount back for everybody. At the same time, I hear Paula, I hate treating non-represented employees differently. I don't like that either. So please persuade me either way. I'm still persuadable.
But what do you mean the other groups that are impacted? Because we're talking about salaries. So what other groups are impacted?
No, anybody that needs any of these resources. So it's not salaries, Paula. It's a question of every cut will affect somebody, right? Whether it's resources for police or fire, or you understand much better than I do. All of these cuts have real effects on how people do their jobs, and not just salary, right? All of these have effects.
Right, but the non-union employees would be feeling those effects of, let's say, expenses getting cut and their direct salary. To me, a direct salary that you've already sort of budgeted your next year on is difficult to take away.
But it is a 1% reduction in a raise, correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
I guess what I might add to that is, Sharon, thank you for that. That's very helpful. And before I make my point, I might, unless anybody objects, Sharon, would you mind unsharing your screen? That way I can see everybody again. As intimidating as you all are, there you are. Thank you.
You just wanted to see my face again.
I was missing Ed.
Yeah, of course.
It's just helpful for me to moderate to see everybody. Thank you. And we can certainly go back to that if you need to. But the point I was going to make is, and I welcome it to be challenged. Think about the finance committee role. We look after fiscal matters of the town. We recommend to the town meeting anything financial related, particularly the budget, and we make decisions according to the best financial interests of the town. So to me, as we look at the HR positions, I feel like that I could make a financial argument for, increasing free cash in order to fund that, because there's a risk question there, and by extension of finance risk potential impact. I have a harder time developing the rationale from a financial perspective on the 1% piece. It's more of an equity argument, and is it finance committee's place to make that judgment? Again, it's a thought that occurred to me. I welcome that to be challenged, but there you go.
So I guess the question here would be, just to be clear, we're talking about a 1% reduction in COLA. So in theory, if they're projected to get a 3% raise, they get a 2% raise. So they're still getting a raise. It's just reduced by 1%. Is that correct?
Yes.
Right. So it's not like we're completely eliminating it. We're saying the budget is, we need to tighten the rope, essentially, is what we're saying, because of the unknowns moving forward. Correct?
I can speak on the town side. There's 162 union members and 162 full-time equivalents. Non-unions, there's 105 people, but there's just 90 full-time equivalents, a lot of part-timers, especially at the library. I'm going to say between 10 and 15% of those 90 FTEs do not get any kind of a step next year because they're on tap step. So their only increase would be a COLA. And then the rest, you're exactly right, would get a step, which is 2%, and then may or may not get a COLA.
Okay, so, you know, if I put all equity aside, right, exactly what you're saying, Eric, if I put all equity aside, I would have to side with both Nick, Eric, and Ed on this topic, which would be the difference of what, 688 in comparison to 768. Am I correct with that? 88,000, right? Difference. I'm just trying to have a hard number because at the end of this meeting, I'm sure we're going to have to, I'm not right.
680 versus 768.
Okay. So, strictly speaking on a financial no equity aside, no equity involved, I would agree with everybody who is having a hard time swallowing the COLA argument. Aside from the main equity, or even I would even call it equality or non-biased treatment approach, I don't really have anything else to sway towards supporting the COLA. Unless you were talking about employee retention and losing employees, then that's a risk that we also have to talk about as well, right? Because that would have a cost associated with it. If someone had direct, I guess, knowledge or presumption that we would lose employees or would have a hard time retaining employees, then I would be more in favor of retaining the COLA. But after hearing everyone speak, I'm going to have to side with the 680 versus the 768.
And like Nick, I remain persuadable. Please.
And as it relates to the non-union increase in COLA, there is still potential through the select board in January, correct, to revisit that?
Or the municipal side.
For the municipal side, okay.
Well, and the school can manage its own budget, right? So I have a question for Paula. I thinking about your comments and very much persuadable. I guess the question for anyone, and Jean as well, expressed kind of thoughts of equity, what I would characterize as equity arguments. How do you put that genie back in the bottle, right? So if we make that exception here, what is the limiting principle for this committee going forward that says that makes this a one-time public health related departure from the original recommended budget from town manager, right? So, and schools, right? Help me understand the limiting principle. That's what I really need to understand from your point of view and anyone's point of view, kind of who's leaning toward favoring this.
So I'm not sure if I'm understanding your question, but in general, at least on the municipal side, and correct me if I'm wrong, Bob, he usually does make it an equitable increase between union and non-union for any given budget. And I do feel like even though we're finance, it is our role to apply the philosophy of the town and the ethical approach across the town. So I don't think it's purely, gee, we only look at the dollars. It's not up to us to think about equity. So what exactly were you asking about the precedent?
That's helpful. I had a feedback. that's helpful, Paul, and I want to hear from others too if they have similar thoughts. I mean, from my point of view, it's like, where does it stop, right? So if the town manager is recommending cuts, a package of cuts, and we want to pick these up to go in a different direction, the next time there's a need to make a cut from whatever people were expecting, and and be it salary or resources, right? All these dollars affect somebody, and on the other hand, most of these dollars, I think they're all taxpayer dollars, right? Ultimately, right? So they're not, it's kind of working with other people's money. So being respectful to everybody involved, what's the objective principle that we say we're going to put this 88,000 in the interest of not treating non-union differently in this portion of their raise? Where Paul, I'm just trying to understand, where does that end? Like, why, if it's in this instance, then the next time that comes up and it's 5% or 8% or some other number, and people say, well, you did it during the COVID crisis for 88,000, why won't you do it for some other number now, right? So it becomes this, how do I think of this as limited to this set of facts?
Paula, did you have?
No, so I am unmuted, but I just want to make sure. I'm just trying to approach it from the way the budget's always approached is that it's equitable. That's where I'm approaching it from, not that. And I think it's very difficult when the leaders need to make cuts, and they have to be the ones to fall on the sword and take the cut. And I think that's tough. We're Jean here.
Can I jump in? Paula, were you done?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
please, Jean, jump in, and then we do have some hands. Please, Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, I think where I'm coming from isn't that not including the 88,000 would create some new precedent. Not including the 88,000 strikes me as a new precedent. We've historically tried to have equity across all groups, and it strikes me, what this real discussion tonight has all been about is what cuts are smart to make and can be sustainable into the future. And I don't think that suddenly changing the equity between COLA between two different groups of employees is a sustainable or a smart or a good thing to do. And it's certainly unprecedented and not how we traditionally manage on both this town and the school side. And John and Bob, jump in if I'm wrong on that. So I'm actually more worried in the other way. The precedent is the kind of trying to be equitable. A decision but in tough budget times, you know what, we won't be equitable. That I think is kind of unprecedented and worrisome. So that's sort of where I'm at.
Jean, what about the point about using free cash for operating expenses here in the interest of equity? How do you approach the precedent of reaching into free cash? Even set aside the amount. It's not the amount that I'm talking about, but any amount.
We're talking about adding $500,000. The proposal that we received adds $500,000 in free cash to support the operating budget, right?
No, 100 of it is, originally. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the positions we're putting back in, these HR positions, that's going to come from free cash. That's operating expenses. The 1.75 that we're using to support the budget is completely unsustainable. I think we're being very honest about that. The reason is because of the uncertain time we're in. But if you don't want, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're talking about using a lot of free cash to support the operating budget for 1 year.
Yeah, I think the HR discussion was around the criticality of the role and the fragility of the existing infrastructure around that role. But I'll let others speak too. I find this really helpful. I hope it's helpful for others.
No, but and also when we use free cash in every year's budget, which we have been for decades now, or over a decade, we're using it for operating expenses. Let's not fool ourselves.
Yep.
That's why I also want Sharon to show that regeneration, because it really nets out that it was just sort of a buffer, knowing we're probably going to be conservative on revenue and spending. So, but when we use that as part of the revenue source, it's being used for operating expenses every single year.
John Parks, I saw your hand up for a long time, and I'm sorry I didn't get to you. I just want to make sure you have a question or a comment.
Not so much a question. It's as far as the 1%. Knowing from the school side, we've got teachers doing incredible work, incredible hours trying to get everybody up and running. We also have administrators that are looking at a 1% pay cut through COLA that are putting in as many hours, if not. And we don't know if that's going to change either over the summer or all the way through next year. Same on the town side. We've got administrators that are going above and beyond that we're now talking about taking a 1% pay cut from them for this year. This is an exceptional time. We all know it. We've got leaders that are stepping up, doing the extra hours. We've got teachers that are union. We don't have to, they're taken care of. They've got the union contract. Our leaders that are non-represented don't have that luxury and are looking at a 1% pay cut right now with an increase in responsibility in leadership in a time we don't know what's going to happen. And we're looking to penalize them by a 1% cut instead of making sure that they get what they've earned. And that would be my take.
Thank you, John. Sean Brant.
Yeah. So my argument in favor of maintaining the 3% COLA or the original COLA percentages would be twofold. One is, and it's not really about the equity, although that point I think is important. One is, folks are making comparisons to kind of the broader labor market, other people that are seeing wage impacts and things like that, and that's fair to sort of call out, and it's certainly fair from kind of an optics perspective. I think it misses one point though, which is that part of the trade-off of working in government is you're trading off sort of a ceiling on your earning potential for some stability and some security. Somebody in Bob's role managing an organization the size he does and a budget the size he does would make multiples of what he does, and that's probably true for a number of people throughout town government. And so I think there's a little bit of it's fundamentally fair to me to sort of do what we said we were going to do and provide folks who work for the town, frankly, at a discount in many cases relative to their skill sets, the security and the stability that we, have historically promised. So that's one piece of it. The second piece of it is, I fully appreciate this conversation around using free cash for operating expenses, and we're signing up for things that compound over time. I just want to highlight though that this lever of COLA adjustments will still be available to us a year from now when we have a lot more information. So if we find ourselves a year from now in a situation where the labor market has fundamentally and irrevocably changed, so wages are down across the board, where we think there are going to be lingering impacts to our budget for years to come, et cetera, we'll still have a lever of COLA that we can pull at that time. And maybe we look back a year from now and say, instead of going from 3 to 2% this year, we need to go from 3 to 1% because we maintained it last year. And that sort of, balances us out over the course of a couple of years. That lever is still going to be there. So from where I sit, where we're thinking about budgets that everybody acknowledges are really uncertain, we don't know how things are going to turn out in the next year, let alone the year after that. It feels to me like we should think about what is the right thing for the people who serve our town, and wait till we have some more clarity before we make decisions that are irreversible at the end of the day.
No, thank you. Chuck, I see your hand.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. A lot of what I was going to say has already been said, but I will say that I'd like to respond. I think others have responded, but to Nick's point and the continual comments about using free cash for operating, we do that every year. We set a free cash amount in the fall town meeting based on FinCom guidance, and that's used for operating. So that's not an argument. We're just talking about doing it at a different time now, but we do it every year when we set FinCom, we get guidance from the FinCom as to how much free cash is going to be used for the operating budget. So I'm not really sure why we're even having that argument now, other than it's a different time of year. I can tell you from my, we didn't vote anything at the FinCom, I mean at the school committee meeting the other night, but you know, there was a motion on the table that actually included this 1%. So I think there was some confusion to whether, I think Tom, I don't think Tom's motion was actually to move the budget that we already passed forward. So that would have included that, that COLA for non-represented employees. Where my head was coming at this is just do the right thing. That's all I'm saying. I mean, we're going around and around on this, and we basically we pulled $100,000 out of the air to add to the FinCom reserve fund. We don't know what that's going to be, and that seemed to be a pretty quick decision by the FinCom to do that. We're just asking to, I think, do the right thing for these employees. A lot of these employees have been a lot of the employees that have been working a lot behind the scenes to do a lot of things for on the school side with the remote learning and all the other things, and on the town side with all the you know, the mass delivery, all the things that are going on. And those are the non-representative, a lot of those are the non-representative employees that are doing that and working different hours of the day and the evening. So I just think it sends them the wrong message to say, you know, we're now we have to, you have to bear some of the brunt of this, and, you know, we're going to cut your COLA back from back by 1%. So that's where I was coming. I wasn't trying to make a science out of it, or I guess if you want to use the term equity, that's where I was. I just think it's an inequity to do for represented one thing and cut non-represented. So again, I'll stop rambling, but that's kind of where I was coming from.
No, thank you, Chuck. I totally hear where you're coming from. I understand the do the right thing kind of approach. I think for me, there's a real kind of pressure testing of everything going on here. I think that it's we might be going around a little bit, but to me, it's a worthwhile conversation just to be thorough. And I think we did have that on the FinCom reserve piece as well. It was, I think we had some healthy discussion there. And the other point I think I'd make is that, you know, in it's a little bit different this year. Normally we have the opportunity to, you know, hear the select board conversations on the town side and the school committee piece on the school budget, and then in many ways take our cues from that in making these decisions. And so your viewpoint there and from others, I think, should play the same role here tonight, and you know, maybe take our cues from that to the extent that makes sense. So I appreciate it. Bob, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I just want to make sure, I want to say a few things just for clarity that I probably said last week. We surveyed the 8 town department heads anonymously, and their top choice was not to cut positions. And a more palatable choice, not a favorite one, was to cut compensation. I didn't ask them, do you want to cut non-union pay? Do you want to cut union pay? I think they all understood there's no practical way for me to sit down with 8 unions in the last month when most of them are very busy and try to negotiate a different contract. So it's not done as an equity issue. It's done as a practical matter that the non-union staff was the only place to go for those cuts. You know, generally speaking, and if the non-union employees are looking to unionize tonight, I'm going to attempt to even that out in the future with collective bargaining. All the town contracts expire after next year. But generally, it's an ebb and a flow. It's not a perfect science. You know, there is give and take. But it wasn't meant to sort of open an equity or inequity conversation. It was really done as it was the only tool in the toolbox to avoid cutting another position.
Thanks, Bob. Nick.
So this has been really helpful. Thank you for all the comments. I've found the discussion really productive. So what I jotted down on the numbers, I kind of recategorized the numbers. So it sounds like the original proposal had 500 free cash, and it seems people are fairly aligned on adding 100 to that for a reserve. About 80 to that, I think, is the number for HR allocated for schools and in the town. And then there's this 88K piece for this 1%. And so it strikes me that one thing I heard from the comments that I just listened to was there's a signaling cost to our actions in the budget. And so I want to be sensitive to that too, that in some sense, we put the 100K in the reserve, but we talked about putting extra 100K in the reserve for FinCom as an insurance policy against unknown unknowns, right? And I'm coming around to a view that after this conversation that there's a certain view of treating people consistently across the different groups. The only reason that, as Bob just said, the 1% who are non-represented got affected was because they could be affected logistically, right? Because of the practicalities of this. So I'm also looking at the fact that there's a real kind of psychological impact and precedent that we're setting if we accept this 1%, not just that, so if we don't do it, there's one cost, which is a human cost, which is also unpredictable, right? It sends a message that if you're not in a union, you're going to be treated a certain way, potentially. And having turnover at this time is a really, really bad thing for everybody, right? So we do not want turnover, in my mind, right? So, and then the HR piece directly targeted at that of kind of avoiding a situation where turnover could adversely affect the functioning of the town and the schools. So I'm coming around to seeing this more as like kind of the long game, kind of a signaling, like what signal do we want to send, and that signal has a cost either way. So that's where my thinking is at this point. I don't know if there are any other comments, but I found this discussion profoundly helpful. So thank you to everyone. There's other views out there that people haven't expressed. I'd be interested. Thanks.
So, I don't know if anyone's hands up. So I guess my question, to branch off of kind of what Bob was saying a little, is in an alternative to eliminating a position, potentially, it came down to the 1% reduction. The question we have to ask ourselves, if we pay the additional $88,000 to make up the 1%, right? Because we're not talking about a decrease in income. We're talking about a decrease in additional raises, right? Or the step or the percentages, right? So we're not saying someone's making 100,000 and now they're going to make 90. We're saying that they won't make 101. Right? Or to that extent. Okay. So the question would be, if we go ahead and we decide, hey, we're going to support the 88,000 from free cash, we decide to keep that 1%, does that potentially in the years to come force us to potentially eliminate a position because we decided to pay the $80,000 this? That'd be one way to look at it. The second way to look at it is a little bit to what Sean was saying, Sean Brandt, of it's a little early on in the game to potentially cut that 1% when we can just readdress this later on in the year, right? Or next year. Okay, so I understand both sides after hearing everyone talk. I would like to hear that either from Bob or Sharon, if we make up this 1% based on your projections, does that potentially, if trends in a negative way, potentially increase the possibility of reducing positions in the near future?
And sorry, Bob, Sharon, before you respond, Paula, could I ask you to just moderate here for the next 2 minutes? Thank you.
Sure. Go ahead, you can respond.
Any additional expense you're going to add on to our operating budget is going to, be a burden to deal with in the future year, and vice versa. I can't imagine anything that's going to happen between now and the fall that's not going to cause us to look at compensation and to minimize it, knowing that, if there's two choices, cut staff and cut compensation, we're going to, I think, always lean towards not cutting staff. We don't have a lot of surplus folks around unless we discontinue doing something. So regardless, respectfully, of what you do tonight, we're going to approach the future budgets the same way, which is to minimize our costs of labor. Both in, the difference would be, and I really don't mean to be giving an opinion, but the difference would be next fall, I'll be negotiating with 8 unions in addition to considering the non-union all at the same time.
Right. So potentially, if we do decide to support the COLA now, we might be having the same conversation in the fall and next spring and so forth and so on. So to Sean's point, it's based upon the lack thereof information, we could support the 3% and the way we've done it in the past. On the same sense, we might be forcing even greater reduction down the road. And I'm just playing devil's advocate, so to speak, here of both options. I can see both sides here. I just wanted to make it clear that we're not decreasing anyone's actual right now income. We're decreasing their additional and step programs and percentages in the future.
Right, and assuming your 88,000 is a one-time thing, if you go that way, and it doesn't recur, we have to balance our budgets, John and I, by a combination of 88,000 less next year. That's just what we do every year. And, we'll look towards wages, we'll look towards expenses. We try to minimize ongoing costs, every year costs. And it is a balancing act. So it could be that the COLA, disappears this year and comes back next year, or vice versa. Who knows?
So not to moderate for Eric or Paula, I don't know if we want to go around just to kind of speed things up here a little bit. I don't know if we want to go around to each FinCom member and see which way we're leaning or not leaning.
I do see Ed's hand raised though. Ed, do you have a comment?
Yeah. So I think the kind of the first point I'll make is that I don't like having this conversation as a general rule. So I don't envy John or Bob's position as far as this goes. This has been fairly uncomfortable for the last hour as it is. But the one point, and I think Nick that might have mentioned this as far as, or someone mentioned something about signaling. I think the one thing to kind of, I keep falling back to is that I think signaling is warranted, and it is going to be kind of needed kind of going forward. I just think there's going to be tougher decisions that everyone's already making them, and then as it relates to this, there are going to be more and more that are going to be made. I hope Tom's wrong as far as the numbers he talked about as far as unemployment, and but most of everything that you read is that this is not a hockey stick. We're not coming right back. And so I think, when you look at these things, in this philosophical nature, everything is a signal. And I do think that we're at the end of the day using the information that's kind of presented to us is that there's going to be more and more tough decisions down the road, and then kind of similar to what we mentioned before, that we're arming ourselves with as much information as we can, and the things that we can punt, we should punt. And so this is where I'm kind of like, I think Gene might have mentioned, I'm right on this line as far as, okay, well, you know, if we punted one thing, we punted one decision down to November because we can, why not this? I just think there's got to be a line you draw, as it relates to this. So a lot of rambling there, but I just think the signaling piece is the one that, I'm probably, certain that needs there's going to be signals and there is going to be repercussions, and we should start to realize that now.
Thanks, Ed. And back to Andrew's suggestion. I don't want to necessarily put anybody on the spot, but I would open it up to Finance Committee just in general. I think anything to add or any other viewpoints on this. Bob, how does this work logistically here? We have to vote on the budget line items. It feels to me, and I'm going to ask the FinCom to liberally correct me if I'm wrong. It feels to me that we are aligned, that we want to add some free cash support to the originally proposed 500 in support. We're aligned. We want to add 100,000 for the Finance Committee Reserve Fund. We were aligned that we want to add 60 plus 20, 80 for the HR payroll position. Where we potentially might still have some differences are on the 88,000 for the COLA. We're voting the line items. That 88,000. How does that fall across the line items for voting?
Do you mind if I share a screen?
Please.
I've just lost control over my Zoom entirely. What's happening?
What's your screen?
I see your screen.
You do? Well, that's good.
Whatever you did, you stuck the landing.
But if you could maximize it, that'd be really good.
Yeah.
I don't see what you're seeing now, so.
That kind of helped.
It would help if I did. Do you see a spreadsheet that looks like the spending scorecard?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, this column is what I'm listening to discuss. And these would be all the things added in, 268,000. That's 60,000 in the school department plus the 53,000. That's 20,000 for administrative services, HR, plus all the COLAs. And there's 100,000 for the FinCom. So that's what it looks like in total for what's on the table tonight. To remove the COLAs would simply remove all these figures here.
Yeah.
And this one here from schools. So it takes away 88,000 from the 268,000. So you do have to decide what to do in the town budget rather specifically by line items. Here's the new total if you do both.
And that includes the 7,000 COLA.
That's correct.
Well, great.
I mean, Eric, I don't hear any discussion about parsing these. It sounds like it's a package that we could put together, and then depending on how the committee votes, that vote would apply to all those line items, right?
Yeah, you're right in that I haven't heard any discussion, unless somebody wants to raise that angle, but I have not heard any discussion about splitting that.
Could we just do an up or down on the whole package of 88?
So I'm trying to figure out the way forward here. I don't. So we could either try to reach a consensus, and those of you that have been in this business longer than I have can guide me here. But to do that, can we do that by a vote? I'm not exactly sure what we'll be voting on, or do we just kind of see if we can get to a consensus? Another way we could do it is to begin to go down through these line items, and somebody will make a motion on, one of them with or without that piece included, and we'll see how that vote goes, and that would tell us where we are. We could vote on U90.
Look at it as a package so that we don't have to go through the labor of line items if we're not in agreement. I think we can sort of, but then we'll have to go through and do the line item math.
And we'll have to vote on the 100K reserve and the 80K for HR too, right? We've got to vote on each of these, right?
What FinCom did before was vote on the top section, lines B99 through F99, the middle section, line G91 through M92, and then the school budget, 3 different votes for the general fund. That's more often than not, most years, that's how it's done.
So,
So I think I could easily make a motion for that top section, right?
Yeah.
Make a motion to approve the revised FY21 budget for $26,367,270. Is that correct, Bob?
Actually, you just want to say as shown because it's really the
Okay.
individual lines, not
Love
the
it.
total.
Love it. Okay. So as shown.
a second.
Second.
So it was a roll call vote. Paula,
Aye.
Ed,
Aye.
Dan, Dan. I can't tell if he's still there or on mute. Does anybody see him?
I'm unmuted.
Sorry, Dan, was that an aye?
Yes.
Thank you. Sean,
Yes.
Jean,
Yes.
Nick,
Yes.
Andrew.
Yes.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Eric is yes. 8-0.
Should I keep going?
Go ahead, Paula.
So I'll make a motion and we're grouping G91 through M92
Right.
to accept it as shown, which includes putting back an HR position.
Restoring an HR position of full-time plus a 1% COLA.
That's correct.
The full year.
Yeah.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Thanks, Jean. Further discussion?
Do we want to split these two or keep them bundled?
What do you mean?
The HR and the 1%. So, if you vote yes, you're in favor of both. If you vote no,
Then you're not in favor of both.
yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Then you're not in favor of that combination, right? So I didn't hear a lot of different views on the HR. I did hear different views on the 1%. So
I wonder if we can move forward with the motion as read, and if you are uncomfortable with it, you could vote no, and then presumably there would be a second vote pulling that amount out.
Exactly.
That's my understanding.
That's okay.
Any other discussion? I'm not sure if you can do this or not. Any other comments from anybody else out of the Finance Committee at this point? I don't see raised hands, so if you have one, make it. All right, we'll move ahead with the vote. Paula,
Aye.
Ed,
No.
Dan,
No.
Sean,
Yes.
Jean,
Yes.
Nick,
yes.
Andrew,
Muted.
Andrew,
No.
Erica's a no. We're split.
So does that mean it does not carry?
That's my understanding. The motion does not carry.
Do you want to make a motion for the HR piece?
Would entertain the motion.
Maybe Bob could guide us on what lines the HR positions correspond to.
Yes, he's doing it right now.
Okay, there you go.
So now the motion is to approve G93 and M92. Is that correct? That's
Correct.
shown.
Second.
Further discussion.
My only last discussion, and this really is that to me it's about risk, and it's risking taking 88,000 more out of free cash. And with the regeneration dollars we saw for the last 7 years, I'm comfortable with that amount of risk. That's really where I'm coming from in terms of the 1%.
That's a good point, Paul.
So this vote is for the HR portion?
And not the 1%.
Right, okay.
Paula, the point you made was, please, can you re-articulate what you said, Paula? Please, sorry.
To me, it's choosing to take additional 88,000 of risk of taking the money out of free cash. And I'm comfortable with that risk because of how much we regenerate every year, and we've shown we have. I think we're extra conservative. And I'd rather take that risk than be inequitable and not compensate people who I agree are working the hardest right now through this terrible crisis. These people are the ones who are having to step up the most right now.
I'd agree with that as well, and I think that this 88,000 potentially coming from free cash again just speaks to sort of buying time with potential to revisit again in the future and pull this compensation lever again if needed, but doing so in a way that's sort of equitable across the board.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's the signaling cost of not taking the 88 out of free cash now and what that could mean for retention. And secondly, I wanted to look at in the fall when we do have a number of contracts collectively up for negotiation. I'd like to address all of the labor issues all together. So I do want to address this. I view this as getting us to the labor negotiation where we put everything's on the table when we do labor costs across, right? And so I don't want to. I'd rather treat everyone kind of look at all of our labor costs together as a whole, rather than taking the small piece of our labor costs now, which isn't going to move the needle on a $110 million budget very much, or 100 million, whatever we are at 90, whatever. But it will have a strong signaling potential. So for me, it's insurance to try to maximize the probability of retention.
So I would actually, beginning of this conversation, I'd probably agree with you. The only thing that is making me lean the other way, Nick, is really you said about signaling, and we have to look at it this way. Right now, it is unprecedented times. Yes, people are working really hard, but they're working, right? Let that be said, right? So something to think about is people are expecting that, I don't want to say expecting pay cuts because that's not what they should be expecting, but they're expecting that this is an unprecedented time. Doing it now versus doing it in November, next spring, or I think it's an easier conversation had now than I think when you give them that 1% and you come back after they said, oh, After COVID-19, we still got our 3%, or we had that 1%, but now you're taking away and the pandemic's over. I think it's a harder conversation further down the road. Yes, we have negotiations coming up. Yes, that is all there. But if you give it to them now, you're setting a precedence moving forward. In this hard conversation, you're just can down the road. I think there's going to be a hard conversation we have in November or spring. I don't see the reason to delay that conversation.
I think the only thing, to Paul's point, the faith in regenerating free cash. That's the other part I've been that's been stuck in my mind for a while, is that, the mechanisms that we're talking about, that Sharon referenced, is that it's split. We underestimate revenues and or it's the other way around. Overestimate. It's on both sides. But I think those are both are at risk. Kind of going forward. The revenue projections, and Bob sent something out over the weekend as far as the bands that are out there, and then we're talking about additional expenses that that the town is going to incur. We're getting kind of pushed on both sides, and that's where again, it's all about that regeneration. That I think I'm questioning if it's going to be at the same clip, and I'm kind of following that it's not, and that's where I think I have these more reservations, because I think philosophically I hate being in the position, of saying, there's, and I know this is not it is, but there's haves and have-nots. That's not, that's not what I signed up for. That's not what I want to be able to discuss. But it's that numbers piece that I'm really stuck on.
I mean, it seems that we just voted ourselves $100,000 more in reserve for something we don't even know what we're going to use it for. But I agree with that, because there's so many unknowns. When you talk about 88,000 for people that I believe this was built, and I'm not sure how the non-represented work, but in many cases, did people have a settled expectation that these raises were coming? I guess that's a question for whoever knows the Sharon or whoever knows the answer. Like, for these employees, is this disturbing a settled expectation about, I thought I was getting 3 and now I'm getting 2? Sounded like it was from the discussion before. Is that fair?
People who are all non-union and they don't know what their increase is supposed to be for fiscal 21. Fiscal 21 yet. So it's more department heads know, people involved in the budgeting process know what was.
It's a pool of money that you're expecting.
Until it's voted at town meeting, nobody really is told anything definitive. So they may have heard, the grapevine that was the plan, but they have not been officially told anything, at least to my knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, if we don't use the reserve, it goes back into free cash, right? If we don't put the 88 in here, people, we definitely won't spend that money for sure. I get that it's a certain savings, which can have benefit on the burn rate downstream. And on the flip side, the thing we're not accounting for is a kind of human component of kind of psychology of kind of trying to keep people retained and treating people consistently across different statuses, whether they're represented or not. That it's not an easy decision. These are all good considerations. For me, I feel like that the certainty of keeping the 88 in there plus having the 100 in reserve, I have a hard time voting for the reserve and then not voting for the 88, given the benefits to everybody of retaining. You could have a lot of turnover and have a lot of people leave and have a huge amount of free cash, and you can't run your town, right? Because ultimately people have to run our town. And so to me, it seems like you want to keep your people in a difficult time, that people's experience that we're going to rely on more than perhaps ever to get through whatever we're going through. So that's a heavy consideration. And I think the fall we'll have a better idea of what we're facing, and we can look at labor costs as a collective whole. So that's where I've come out.
Right. So Nick, but we're talking about retention versus increasing, right? So, we're talking about employment versus benefits or versus increased compensation. We're not saying we want to take away. I think the big thing here is we want to retain our employees, and with these unprecedented times, I'm sure they didn't assume that they'd be working off shift hours and so saying that people are assuming X amount of raise based upon what word of mouth is going on out there, when they don't even know what they're going to get in 2021. This is an internal conversation about what the capabilities we currently have to do that. So I think having the ability to offer them a sustained employment with a slight reduction in benefits is an amazing plus, because there's a lot of people out there who are cutting positions, right? And we're saying, no, we're not going to cut a position. We're just going to reduce the benefits and continue moving forward. The reserve fund is a completely different concept in that regard, right? The reserve fund potentially just comes back to us, right, if we don't use it, and is a direct savings, like you said. So I find it hard, because I think if we keep pushing this down the road, we're going to have the same 3-hour conversation months from now, and we're going to have to relook at it again, and we're going to sit here and say the same thing. And then I think it is going to come out to a plate where it's going to be, maybe it's a 2%, or maybe it's no increase, right? And then we have a real retention problem.
Well, since you're already on RCTV tonight, I don't think that it's an internal conversation.
Right, these are all public. Yeah.
Right. I think I think you understood what.
I think for me, I don't know if this will be helpful, but Nick's point about dealing with all of the labor costs at one time or closer to one time is fairly compelling, because the one constant in this conversation is all the uncertainty we have about the future. And I guess how I'm feeling is, with a lack of clarity on just what the future is going to be, it feels premature to take this approach to wages because we think it might be bad. I guess I'd like more clarity on exactly what the future is and what the impact will be. And it just seems like discussing wages, I'd rather do it all at once, as closer to all at once for everybody. And I also think that, I think that it'll be an easier discussion when we know more, which we just don't right now.
Yeah, that again is exactly my point as well, Gene, is that I feel like this sort of measure taken now sort of again just buys us that time once we do learn more, and again gives us the opportunity to pull a lever across the board when we're having the wage conversation, and not have that potential to have that distinction between union and non-union that we would really be introducing here now in advance of all the additional information that we might learn between now and then in the future.
Right, and setting a precedent, right?
Yes, exactly, yes.
A question for Bob. Do we have when you work these numbers up, Bob, did you do any kind of I'm just going to use the term sensitivity analysis, I'm probably misusing it, but I think it's a good point that I think Andrew brought up, that if we bake in this 88K now, that's the base for next year, right? And so you're increasing your labor costs in the future if you don't make cuts then, and those are bigger cuts later that impact people, right? So, Bob, I guess the question for me is, what evidence do we have that including this 88K will have a significant impact on ability to retain people, the affected people in the town? And I guess the school, right? There's a school component in that as well, if I remember right. Is it, if we have a 5% fluctuation in revenues to the wrong side, or we don't regenerate, 10% of the free cash we normally do, then all of a sudden we have to cut 3 positions we wouldn't otherwise have to cut. I'm totally making these numbers up, but how serious is that consideration of if we include this 88K, we're setting people up for a more difficult situation sooner rather than later, because if we miss by even a little bit here, there, or anywhere, then suddenly the FTEs have to go flying and we have to start cutting people because they cost too much. Because that's a serious consideration in retention. There's the voluntary retention, which is what I was thinking of. And then there's involuntary retention, which is we simply can't carry all the FTEs because we don't have enough money in next year, the year after, the year after.
I'll just answer for the town side. If we're, you're talking about $35,000 for a full year. If it's added to the baseline now for FY21, then I just have to find a way, and let's just stick to wages, of cutting 35,000 out across the union plus non-union workforce next year in FY22. So it's a, somewhat simpler thing to spread it out over a much larger workforce if you want to look at it that way. I'm not concerned. I mean, you never know what any person might do, but I'm not concerned that this is going to, cause a mass exodus from the workforce of the town of Reading. That's not why most people are here. But I am very sensitive, having suggested this, to the signal it does send. I totally understand that. And it's generally, up until March of this year, we were in the strongest employment market in any of our lives, and we had a really hard time attracting and retaining staff. I can't tell you whether that's now 180 degrees different, and if it is, for how long. There's just no way to know.
Bob, another question for me, and it's something you mentioned. Do you have the preference of dealing with all of this labor at the same time, or or if you could, have all of these discussions, or have this one, kind of taken care of versus, dealing with the other 7 come the fall, or whenever that time frame is.
Well, let me pose a possible solution. If FinCom approves what's in front of you now, the 20 and the 60, and doesn't approve the COLA for either side, I don't know what we're going to know in October, but in October, in theory, you're going to be voting on a November town meeting warrant. It could be restored in November, and it could be said to be retroactive to July 1st. But I really just don't know how much more information you're going to have in October compared to today. It's the uncertainty that makes this such a difficult conversation.
I see your hand raised.
Yeah, mute, Tom.
Thank you. Sorry about that, Paula. A couple things as I've been listening to the conversation that I don't know have come up in it, and I just wanted to raise it for people's awareness. If you looked at Sharon's regeneration fund, there's a high correlation between the low regeneration numbers and the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate early in the 2010s was pretty much 0. And what do we have right now? 0. It's pretty much gone to nothing. There's a correlation there. As it started raising, our restoration went up rather large. So you see the 1.5 million early in the 2010s. You got up to 3.5, 4 million. As you got later in the 2015, 16, 17, that's what federal funds started going up. So we don't know when that's going to go back up necessarily, but to say that we're comfortable that regeneration would happen at the levels it was happening is not acknowledging, in my mind, and maybe I'm missing something too, the macroeconomic factor of federal funds rate and what the actual return on our money is going to be. That's one thing. Second thing is, it seems to me like as the conversation's going on, we're making it sound like negotiating with the unions next year is going to be easy. Like, oh yeah, everybody's just going to take a small adjustment across the board. That may or may not be the case. We don't know for sure, and we can't really talk about it in too much detail. But I think we shouldn't minimize the challenge that's coming forward with having pretty much all the unions being negotiated at the same time. And the last thing is the labor force is a relative thing. You know, we are in relatively strong shape to be where we are, that we're not doing layoffs. There are other towns that we heard last week are likely to look at massive cuts, inclusive of potential layoffs. So we're not only keeping employees, we are giving them raises. Maybe it's not as much as people want, but we are giving them raises, and other towns are laying people off. So it's all relative here. And we need to keep in mind some of the historical context as well.
Further discussion from anybody? Don't worry about raising your hand.
I noted Bob's point about spreading out on the town side that if it is 35,000, if that's the number we're going to use over a larger group, to me was another reason to favor the 88. Although I realize the 88 includes some school too, but presumably that, and maybe someone from the school side can speak to this, but presumably that dynamic would also exist where any kind of school component in that 88,000 could be spread out later over, if it needed to be cut later, over a larger collection of the workforce, therefore minimizing the number of the impact on people.
Yeah, Nick, it's 53,000 for the schools. So it would be similar.
And when are the contracts up, Dr. Darty? Are they all up this fall for the?
Yeah, same as the town next June.
So we got 5 on the school side and 8 on the town.
5 on the school, correct?
Different union contracts. Yeah. So we've been negotiating presumably with more knowledge than we have now about what the circumstances are going to be.
I hope so.
Hopefully, presumably. I mean, it could be a whole other set of uncertainties. I mean, the flu season is going to be coming. Like we just don't know. It may not be any more certain.
So I don't know how much this actually would impact the bottom line, but I do think that there'll be some certainty in the fall around schools opening. They either will or they won't. And what the costs of making that happen should be much clearer. So I think that there's some expenses that we'll have some clarity around. And I would hope that on the state side, we'd have more information than we do now about the anticipated hit to state revenues, particularly, and actually even things like the meals tax. I think by July, August, we're going to know how open restaurants are. So I do think we'll know more in the fall than we do now.
Anyone else? All right. I'm not sure this is a move I can make, so please keep me honest, those of you who know better than I. Who made the motion on the table right before us right now? Paula, was it you?
No.
It was me.
And did we get a second?
We did.
Oh, so it's on the table. So we have to vote it, right?
Unless whoever made the motion withdraws it. Is that true? I don't know the answer to that. Is that true?
The motion can be withdrawn or amended or voted on.
So the only thing I see here as shown is the HR position for the town, right? The school number.
School's underneath it.
We haven't
Line
gotten.
28.
But we're not, okay, so we do this separately. All right, so it's just the HR position for the town that's on the table right now.
I can make an amendment.
I'd entertain an amendment.
Okay, I'll make an amendment that we add the 1% COLA back in. Do I have a second?
Do I hear a second?
Second.
Any discussion?
Now we have to vote on the amendment.
Roll call vote. Paula,
Aye.
Ed,
Aye.
Dan,
Aye.
Sean,
Yes.
Jean,
Yes.
Nick,
This is on the amendment.
correct?
No.
Andrew? Andrew, can't tell if you're on mute.
No.
Eric is a yes. Motion, amendment carries.
Okay, so we're back to the two combined.
Correct.
All right.
Any more discussion? Do a roll call vote.
Let's just wait for Bob to move all the numbers so we have them correct.
So in essence, this is the
88 plus the HR, right? We're back to the last motion.
the vote.
Right.
Paula?
Aye.
Paula, you're inaudible to me. Paula, one more time.
Aye.
Thank you. Ed?
Aye.
Dan?
Aye.
Sean?
Yes.
Jean?
Yes.
Nick?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Eric is a yes. Unanimous. Would entertain a motion on U99.
Motion to accept U99 as presented.
I think that was Ed.
Yes, I'm sorry, that was Ed, sorry.
I'll second that.
Seconds from Nick. Any discussion?
Bob, this is updated with the 1%.
Yes, it is.
And the HR.
Correct.
Any more discussion? Paula?
Aye.
Ed?
Aye.
Dan?
Aye.
Sean?
Yes.
Jean?
Yes.
Nick?
Yes.
Andrew?
Aye.
Eric is a yes. Motion carries. 8-0. Looks like we need a few more motions.
Water and sewer each need a motion, or you can do the whole block.
I'll make a motion for revising the budget for W99, X99 as shown.
Do I have a second?
This is Ed, I'll second.
Further discussion? Paula?
Aye.
Ed?
Aye.
Dan?
Aye.
Sean?
Yes.
Jean?
Yes.
Nick?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Eric is a yes. Motion carries 8-0. Need a motion on stormwater?
No, that's okay.
It didn't change, right?
Right.
Oh, didn't change. You're right. Okay.
My head hurts.
Is that all we had to vote on, Bob?
Nope. Oh, no, there's more.
Okay.
I want to stop right there though and just acknowledge that was not an easy conversation. It's not one I enjoyed having, but it was a necessary conversation, and this is why we're here. So I want to thank not just the members of the finance committee, but the school committee and the select board and everybody else who weighed in on helping us along there. It probably didn't seem like we got kind of down a rabbit hole or two, but I hope the town would appreciate we err in that direction than not enough conversation. So thank you to everybody for what else do we have?
I think it's important for us to agree to disagree sometimes.
So Sure, Eric, I'm sorry to interrupt. I had my hand raised. I would echo that. I want to say thank you, on behalf of the school department. I know it gets animated at times, but we know how hard you guys work too, and it put you in difficult positions, and appreciated all the, the candid conversation. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you, Chuck. Further business?
Are you seeing the warrant report now as a shared screen?
No, it's starting to come up now. Yeah, it's coming up now. Yeah, it's up.
Yes.
So there are some articles that have changed through our, your discussion the last week or two. Warrant Article 4 is the list of capital. You can see there's a $930,000 reduction to FY21. A little bit more subtle is we don't need the $20,000 that had been requested for the current year's budget. The facilities completed its job. And then there's a large increase in FY22 since a pretty big percent of the 930 was just moved out a year, not all though. So there was those changes in capital. And then there will be some additional changes in the FY20 budget, which we'll get to next. You want me to review everything at first?
Oh, just a little question though, for FY22 though, so what percent of the budget was that then for capital?
So FY22, the capital plan that would be, if this change goes through, it would be unbalanced. And it would be several $100,000 overdrawn.
Oh, would, okay.
With the idea that either some of the capital will be moved into November or we'll have to balance it for next April for the annual process.
Yeah, I hear you.
Eric, do you want me to just continue through the rest of the articles? There's only a couple more, or do you want to stop and vote?
Let's stop and vote while it's fresh.
Yeah. So would entertain a motion. Or any questions for Bob from anybody?
So Bob, this is this one here that it's Article 4.
Yes, that's correct.
I'll make a motion to accept Article 4 as shown.
Second.
Further discussion?
In response to the question, I just called up the capital plan revised.
Yeah.
It's $700,000 out of balance.
Out of balance.
Projecting spending just 4.8% instead of 5%, so it's close.
Yeah, but it's under the assumption that we'll readdress this.
Yes.
Time nears.
Yep.
Everybody else good?
Yep.
Yep.
All right. Roll call vote. Paula.
Aye.
Ed.
Aye.
Ann.
Aye.
Sean.
Yes.
Jean.
Yes.
Nick.
Yes.
Andrew.
Yes.
Eric is a yes. Motion carries 8-0.
And next is Article 5. There's the $20,000 reduction of capital that we don't need. There's an increase in $35,000 for the Essex North Vocational School that we do need. And then, we didn't really have the discussion about this year, but last March when you last met, we had discussed increasing your reserve fund, which is currently $100,000 by $200,000 to $300,000. Whether that's necessary on June 15th town meeting, who knows? I would say it's fine to leave it alone for now, and this could easily be amended on the floor of town meeting if you don't need a $300,000 reserve fund at that point. So that the only two changes that I have suggested is removing a small capital item and putting in the Voc School number. Then down in, let me just check. Yeah, there's no change. The water one is still 82,000. So that's the only change.
This is Article 5, Bob.
Yes.
Motion to accept Article 5 as shown. This is Ed. Sorry, Eric.
Second.
Second from Dan. Further discussion? Okay, roll call vote. Paula?
Aye.
Ed?
Aye.
Dan?
Aye.
Sean?
Yes.
Jean?
Yes.
Nick?
Yes.
Andrew?
Aye.
Eric is a yes. Motion carries 8-0.
If I could just show you one last thing, I'll just need to go find it. Welcome to my world.
Yeah, what a messy desktop.
Yeah, but it's only half the desk. I wanted to show you the streamlined version of town meeting that we're discussing. There'll be another meeting on Wednesday. I'd say there's a pretty good likelihood that we'll only do these articles in and around the blue lines. So Article 4 and 5 that you just voted, Article 7, which will move OPEB funds into a trust. Article 10, we do have one debt authorization, as I mentioned, that really is pretty important that we do it. Chapter 90 is just accepting road money from the state, and then Article 17 is the budget. So everything else we'll omit a couple of them. Some of them the town moderator has asked for in writing, and then a number of them will be pushed most likely to November town meeting. So hopefully this is a one-night town meeting. That's certainly the objective.
So, Bob, question on this. Are there any other pieces? I show that for like 10, 16, and 17, our FinCom reports are already, we didn't need to change them, correct?
That's correct. I didn't list those. You already voted to who
Gotcha.
would do the reports. I didn't update this page.
Gotcha. Okay, just making sure.
Yep. So that's all.
I believe we reached the end of business, except, were there minutes? There were from last time.
I had sent the March 18th minutes for the previous meeting.
Good. Did the committee have a chance to review and prepare to vote tonight?
Yeah.
Would entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion to accept the meeting minutes from, is that March?
March 18th.
Is that 18th?
Oh, wait, no, what was the, yeah, March 18th, right?
Yes.
I had it.
Yeah.
Second.
Second from Andrew. Roll call vote. Paula?
Aye.
Ed?
Aye.
Ian?
Aye.
Sean?
Yes.
Jean?
I'll abstain since I wasn't at the meeting.
Nick?
Abstain.
Andrew?
Aye.
Eric? Motion carries 6-0. I believe we reached the end of business.
Could I just ask you for a formality?
Please.
I think the understanding is you're taking all those changes from free cash, but if FinCom would vote that, it would be helpful. So you've just asked for $768,000 additional to be used in free cash. So I believe the new number is $2,018,000, if I've done the math right.
You have.
So if FinCom would just make a motion, just so town meeting can see that you've done that.
I'll make the motion. This said, motion to, what is it, allocate
To use $2,018,000 in free cash to balance the FY21 budget.
I motion to do what Bob just said. I motion just to.
That works.
So moved. So moved, Ed.
Okay, so motion from Ed. I didn't hear the second before Nick.
Paula.
Somebody said it.
Paula.
Paula jumped all over.
Paula. All right. Gotta get the record straight. Roll call vote. Paula.
Aye.
Ed.
Aye.
Dan.
Aye.
John.
Yes.
Ian.
Yes.
Nick.
Yes.
Andrew.
Aye.
Eric is a yes. Motion carries 8-0. Any other questions, comments from anybody?
Thank you, everyone, for your patience. That's all I got.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, Eric, great job.
Great meeting,
Doing
Eric.
this again.
Nice
Yeah,
job,
great
Eric. Well
Yeah,
done.
nice job, Eric.
Thanks to everyone on this. We earned our salary tonight. Thank you so much. Motion, I guess we need to entertain a motion to adjourn. But before the finance committee does that, I'll give the select board and the school committee an opportunity. To adjourn.
School committee have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn the school committee.
Aaron,
Aye.
Sean,
Aye.
John,
Aye.
Carla,
Aye.
Tom,
Aye.
Chuck, aye. Thanks again, guys.
Thanks, Chuck.
Thanks, Chuck.
Hi, this is Ann Landry. I believe the select board is effectively adjourned because there are only two of us remaining. So I don't think we need to move to adjourn. I think we are effectively adjourned.
Thanks for hanging in till the bitter end.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. All right, would you say a motion from the finance committee?
Motion to adjourn the finance committee. Might be my last one.
Second.
I think that second was from Dan, if I heard it right. Paula, with your last vote, potentially.
Aye.
Thank you.
Let that sink in for a minute. Ed.
Now I'm conflicted. Aye.
Yeah.
Take care, Paula. Aye.
John.
Yes.
Jean.
Thank you for your service. You're going to be missed. Aye.
Oh, thank you so much. Aye.
Andrew.
Thanks, Paula. Aye.
And Paula, you've been a rock. Couldn't have done this without you. Thank you so much. All right. Yes. Motion carries 8-0.
Night all.
Good night.
Good night.
Aye.